Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. We'd done the work ourselves, patching the roof where it leaked, reinforcing the walls, clearing out years of leaves and dirt. There was something special about having our own place deep in the woods where no one could find us. No parents, no rules, just us boys living off the land for a few days each summer. We'd been going there for 3 years by that point, and this was going to be our last trip before college applications and real life took over. The cabin was pretty small, maybe 15 by 20 feet with just one room, and this tiny door that couldn't have been more than 5 feet high. You had to duck to get in, which was funny because we used to joke that whoever built it must have been a hobbit or something. Inside was basic, a stone fireplace, some shelves we'd built, and enough floor space for our sleeping bags. No electricity, no running water, just genuine backwoods camping. That final night started like all our others. We'd spent the day hiking, fishing in the stream about half a mile from the cabin, and telling the same stupid stories we always did. Kyle had brought his dad's .22 rifle for protection, though mostly we just used it to shoot at cans and pretend we were hunters. None of us were particularly good shots, but having the gun made us feel more secure up there in the middle of nowhere. We'd turned in around 11, exhausted from a day of messing around in the woods. I remember falling asleep almost immediately, listening to Mike snoring and Trevor mumbling something about a math test in his sleep. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, giving off just enough light to see shadows. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. Had to be after midnight. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Maybe an owl or the wind picking up, but then I heard it. This deep, rhythmic huffing sound coming from outside the cabin. Not quite breathing, but something more deliberate. Huff, huff, huff. My first thought was bear. We'd seen black bears in the area before, usually keeping their distance, but everyone knows they're attracted to food smells. We'd been careful with our trash, but maybe not careful enough. I reached over and shook Mike's shoulder. "Hey," I whispered, "wake up. I think there's something outside." Mike groaned but sat up, and then he heard it too. The huffing was steady, almost mechanical in its consistency. Huff, huff, huff. "What the hell is that?" he whispered back. One by one we all woke up, huddled in our sleeping bags, listening to whatever was outside. It wasn't just passing by, it was circling the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, moving around the perimeter like it was inspecting every inch. "Bears don't do that," Trevor whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "They don't just circle like that." He was right. Whatever this was, it was moving with purpose. When it reached the back wall of the cabin, we could hear it. I don't know how else to describe it, except to say it was testing the structure. Not attacking or clawing, but pushing against the logs, like it was checking how solid they were. The whole wall creaked under the pressure. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. None of us said anything as we listened to it continue around the side wall, still with that steady huffing sound. Huff, huff, huff. Kyle had grabbed the rifle and was checking to make sure it was loaded. His hands were shaking so badly, I wondered if he'd accidentally shoot one of us instead. "What are you going to do with that?" Ethan hissed. "You don't even know what's out there." "I'm not just going to sit here," Kyle shot back, though I noticed he was whispering too, like whatever was outside might understand us if we spoke too loudly. The huffing stopped suddenly, and for a moment we thought maybe it had gone away. But then came a new sound. Something sliding along the front wall of the cabin, right by the door, like thick, heavy fingers dragging across the wood. Then a thud against the door itself, not like it was trying to break in, more like it was testing this entrance too. The door shuddered but held firm. Trevor looked at all of us, his face pale in the dim light from the dying embers. "We need to see what it is," he said shakily. "Are you insane?" I remember whispering back. "Whatever's out there is huge. If it's a bear, we need to scare it off before it decides to really try breaking in," Trevor said. "And if it's something else, don't we want to know?" I didn't want to know. Every instinct in my body was screaming to stay put, to wait until morning, to pretend this wasn't happening. But I also knew Trevor had a point. Whatever was outside wasn't leaving, and the cabin suddenly felt a lot less secure than it had an hour earlier. Kyle raised the rifle to his shoulder, his knuckles white around the grip. "I'll cover you," he told Trevor, who had somehow volunteered to be the one to open the door. I'll never forget watching Trevor crawl toward that tiny door, reaching for the crude latch we'd installed. The huffing had started again. So close now it was like it was in the room with us. Huff, huff, huff. Trevor looked back at us one last time, and I could see he was terrified. We all were. But there was also this weird determination on his face, like he needed to know what we were dealing with. He pulled the latch and pushed the door open just a crack at first. Moonlight spilled in across the floor, surprisingly bright. The huffing stopped immediately. Trevor pushed the door open wider, enough that he could stick his head out and look around. For a second, nothing happened. Then I heard him make this strangled gasp, and he scrambled backward so fast he fell onto his back. And that's when I saw it too, through the open doorway. Two massive hairy legs standing not 5 feet from our cabin. Not bare legs, they were straight, standing upright, covered in thick, dark hair. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The legs were huge, thicker than my entire body, and they just kept going up beyond what I could see through the doorway. Kyle didn't hesitate. He fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the small cabin. The scream that followed is something I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. This high-pitched, guttural screech that seemed to go on forever, vibrating through the cabin and making my ears ring. Then came the crashing, the sound of something enormous plowing through the forest at incredible speed. It sounded like boulders tumbling down a mountainside, trees splintering, undergrowth being obliterated. The whole ground shook with each impact, moving further away but still far too close. None of us moved for what felt like hours. The door was still open, moonlight still pouring in, but no one wanted to be the one to go close it. Finally, Ethan crawled forward and quickly pulled it shut, sliding the latch back into place, though we all knew it would do absolutely nothing if that thing came back. "What the fuck was that?" Mike finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "I shot it," Kyle said, looking down at the rifle like he'd never seen it before. "I shot it and it just screamed and ran." "Those weren't bear legs," Trevor said, still on his back where he'd fallen. "They were standing straight up, like a person's, but bigger, so much bigger." We stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled together in the center of the cabin like little kids, afraid of the dark. We kept the rifle pointed at the door, taking turns holding it though our hands were all shaking too badly to have hit anything. The fire died completely, but no one wanted to move to add more wood. Every sound from the forest made us jump, an owl hooting, a branch breaking, the wind picking up before dawn. But the thing didn't come back, at least not that we could hear. As the first grey light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the walls, we were still sitting there, exhausted but too terrified to sleep. Eventually, Jason stood up on legs that looked barely able to support him. "We need to get out of here," he said simply. No one argued. We packed our stuff in record time, barely speaking, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd seen. Before we left, we forced ourselves to look outside, to see if there was any evidence that would help us make sense of what happened. About 6 feet from the cabin door was a patch of disturbed earth, like something heavy had stood there, and then launched itself away. The impressions were deep, at least 2 inches into the hard-packed soil. roughly foot-shaped but much larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. There were 5 distinct toe marks at the front of each impression. We looked for blood, thinking Kyle's shot must have hit something, but there was nothing. Not a drop. Just those massive footprints and a path of destruction leading away from the cabin, broken branches, flattened undergrowth, even a small tree that had been snapped completely in half about 7 feet up from the ground. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We grabbed our packs and practically ran down the mountain, taking the 3-mile trail back to where we'd left Ethan's truck in record time. No one suggested stopping to rest or eat. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. The drive back to town was almost completely silent. What do you say after something like that? We were trying to process what we'd seen, what we'd heard, but nothing made sense. It wasn't until we were almost back to civilization that Kyle finally spoke up. "It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" he said quietly, not looking at any of us. "A fucking Bigfoot." Nobody answered right away. Using that word made it seem ridiculous, like we were little kids telling campfire stories. But we'd all seen those legs, heard that scream, felt the ground shake as it ran away. "I don't know what else it could have been," Trevor finally admitted. "It was standing on 2 legs. It was covered in hair. It was huge. My dad's going to kill me when he finds out I fired his rifle at a Bigfoot," Kyle said. And somehow that broke the tension. We all started laughing, this weird, hysterical laughter that wasn't really about anything being funny. We made a pact in Ethan's truck that day. We wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. Not our parents, not our friends, not the local rangers. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be labeled as troublemakers, or attention seekers, or just plain liars. So we agreed to keep it between ourselves. That was 45 years ago, and this is the first time I've broken that promise. The other guys might be mad if they knew I was writing this, but I don't think it matters anymore. Jason died of cancer last year. Mike moved to Australia in the 90s, and we lost touch. Trevor and Ethan are still around, and we get together sometimes, but we never talk about that night. But I think about it, more than I should, probably. I've gone over every detail 1,000 times, trying to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe even a person playing a prank on some stupid teenagers. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I've never gone back to those mountains, never wanted to. But sometimes I wonder if that cabin is still there, if that thing is still out there, circling and huffing, and waiting for someone else to open that tiny door. I don't know why it didn't attack us. Kyle's shot couldn't have hurt it much. A .22 would barely penetrate the hide of something that size. Maybe it was just curious, maybe we were lucky, or maybe we were being warned to stay away. All I know for sure is that something was in those woods that night, something that wasn't supposed to exist. And sometimes, when I'm camping or even just out in my backyard at night, I catch myself listening for that huffing sound again. Huff, huff, huff. And I wonder what I would do if I ever heard it again. Story 2. I still can't explain what happened to me in 1974, but after hiding this for almost 50 years, I feel like I need to share it somewhere. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can make sense of it, because I sure as hell can't. I grew up in Douglas County, Oregon in the early 60s on a remote homestead about 40 acres in size. Our property was nestled in thick forest near the Umpqua River, completely cut off from the nearest town. My parents were what people today would call off-grid types. They wanted to live simply, close to nature, away from everyone else. Our little cabin had no electricity, just oil lamps and a wood stove. We collected water from a natural spring about a quarter-mile from our cabin. My siblings and I would take turns making the trek through the woods with buckets. I was about 11 or 12 when it happened the first time. It was my turn to collect water, and I remember it was late afternoon in the summer, almost dusk. The shadows were getting long, and the forest was starting to get that eerie quality. You know, when the light is fading but it's not quite dark yet. I knew every inch of that path to the spring. I'd walked it 1,000 times before. About halfway there, I got this weird feeling. It was like a cold spot, almost like walking through invisible cold water. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just dead silence. I kept walking, but more cautiously now. When I reached the clearing where our spring was, I bent down to fill my first bucket. That's when I felt it, this overwhelming sense that something was watching me. I slowly turned and looked up at the opposite slope, maybe 50 yards away. And there it was. I can't adequately describe the shock of seeing something so completely out of place in those woods. Standing upright between two massive Douglas firs was this figure. It was enormous. I'd guess close to 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair or fur, but not like a bear. It stood perfectly upright on 2 legs, with arms hanging at its sides that seemed too long for its body. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, easily twice the width of my father's, and he was a big man. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could tell it had a massive head that seemed to sit directly on those huge shoulders, with barely any neck. And it was watching me, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there, probably only seconds, but it felt like forever. Then my survival instinct kicked in, and I slowly backed away, leaving my bucket behind. Once I had some trees between us, I turned and ran all the way home, faster than I'd ever run in my life. I never told my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I thought they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I was worried they'd forbid me from going to the spring alone, and I'd have to explain why to my siblings. So I kept it to myself. And although I was terrified every time I had to go to the spring after that, I never saw the creature again during my childhood. Life went on. I grew up, moved away for a while, had a son of my own. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I ever mentioned what I'd seen to anyone. I was visiting my sister, who was 4 years older than me, and we were reminiscing about growing up on the homestead. I don't know what made me finally open up, but I told her about what I'd seen that day. The look on her face is something I'll never forget. She went completely pale. Then she told me her own story. When she was about 14, she'd gone to the spring alone. She'd been sitting on a log, filling her bucket, when she got the feeling she was being watched. She looked up and saw what she described as a giant hairy man perched on a fallen log about 20 yards above the spring, just staring at her. She said she'd been too scared to move at first, but when it stood up to its full height, she dropped everything and ran. We both sat there in shocked silence. We'd both seen the same thing, years apart, and never told anyone. Fast forward to 1974. I was 33 years old, and my little boy was 7. My parents had passed away a few years before, leaving the property to me and my siblings. No one wanted to live there full-time anymore. It was too remote, too primitive, but we'd take turns using it as a getaway. That fall, my son and I went out there to spend a couple weeks during his school break. The first few days were great. We fished in the river, explored the woods, and I showed him all the places I used to play as a kid. I was nervous about the spring, but we always went together, and I never let him out of my sight. It was our 5th night there when everything went to hell. We'd spent the day cutting firewood and were sitting outside by our fire pit, roasting potatoes in the coals for dinner. The sun had set, but we had a good fire going. My son was telling me some story about school when I noticed the silence. It was exactly like that day when I was a kid, that unnatural, complete absence of sound. No crickets, no frogs from the nearby creek, nothing, just the crackling of our fire. Then came the feeling of being watched. It was overwhelming, like an actual physical weight pressing down on me. I casually reached over and pulled my son closer to me mid-sentence, trying not to alarm him. "What's wrong, Dad?" he asked, immediately picking up on my tension. "Nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just thought I heard something. Let's head inside. It's getting late." We got up and started walking toward the cabin. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl from the edge of the forest, maybe 30 yards away. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. It was deeper, more guttural, and somehow intelligent. It sounded angry. My son clutched my hand. "Dad?" His voice was shaking. "It's okay," I whispered, though I knew it wasn't. "Just walk slowly to the cabin." We took a few more steps, and that's when the first rock hit the ground beside us. It was the size of a softball and slammed into the dirt hard enough to embed itself an inch or two into the soil. Then another one, larger, crashing through the branches of a nearby tree before thumping heavily to the ground. Something was throwing rocks at us, large rocks, with force. I scooped up my son and ran for the cabin. I locked the door behind us, but even as I was turning the lock, I knew how pathetic our protection was. The cabin was old, built by my father with hand-hewn logs, strong in its own way, but not against whatever was out there. "Get under the bed," I told my son. "Stay there until I tell you it's okay to come out." He crawled under my parents' old bed while I grabbed my father's rifle from above the fireplace and checked that it was loaded. Then I flipped off all the oil lamps except one, which I turned down low. For the next hour we listened to movement outside, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, occasional thumps against the outer walls. Once, something scraped along the side of the cabin. It sounded like enormous fingernails dragging across the logs. My son was crying quietly under the bed. I was terrified, but trying to stay calm for him. "It's just an animal," I kept saying. "It'll get bored and go away." But I knew this wasn't normal animal behavior. Around midnight, the noises stopped. The forest was still eerily silent, but at least whatever was out there had stopped circling us. I wanted to believe it had left, but that feeling of being watched persisted. I made a decision. Our nearest neighbor, an old-timer named Frank, lived about 3 miles away through the forest. There was a trail I knew well, even in the dark. If we left now, moved quietly, we might make it to his place by dawn. "Listen," I whispered to my son. "We're going to go for a little walk to Mr. Frank's house. We have to be very quiet, okay? Like we're playing hide and seek." He nodded, his eyes enormous in the dim light. I filled a small backpack with as much water and food as I could quickly gather. I loaded my pockets with ammunition for the rifle. Then I wrapped my son in his warmest jacket, put on my own, and cracked the back window to see if I could spot anything. The night was clear, with a 3/4 moon giving just enough light to see by. I couldn't spot any movement among the trees, but that feeling of being observed was still overwhelming. I made a decision. If something was watching the cabin, we'd have a better chance slipping out the back and immediately into the thick forest rather than using the front door, which faced a more open area. I helped my son through the window first, then passed him the backpack and finally climbed out myself, rifle in hand. We crouched beneath the window for a moment listening. Nothing. "Stay right behind me," I whispered. "Step where I step." We made our way to the tree line, moving as quietly as possible. Once under the cover of the forest, I got my bearings and started leading us toward the trail that would take us to Frank's place. We'd gone maybe a 1/4 mile when we heard it, branches breaking behind us, heavy footfalls. Something was following us, and it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. It was gaining on us. "Run," I told my son, grabbing his hand. We ran through the dark forest, me half dragging my 7-year-old who was doing his best to keep up. I could hear our pursuer crashing through the underbrush behind us, moving faster than we were. It was getting closer. I made a split-second decision and veered off the trail, pulling my son into a dense thicket of young firs. We huddled there, trying to quiet our breathing. I raised my rifle, pointing it in the direction of the sounds. The footfalls slowed, then stopped. I could hear heavy breathing, deep, raspy breaths that no human could make. It was sniffing the air, trying to catch our scent. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we sat frozen in that thicket, while something enormous prowled just yards away, searching for us. Eventually, the footsteps began to move away, back in the direction of the cabin. We waited until we couldn't hear it anymore, then continued our journey to Frank's house, staying off the trail and moving as quietly as possible. We reached his place just as dawn was breaking. I pounded on his door, practically collapsing when he opened it. Frank took one look at us, exhausted, terrified, my son in tears, and pulled us inside. I gave him the shortest version of events I could, just saying we'd been spooked by something outside our cabin and decided to hike out. He probably thought I was overreacting to normal forest sounds, but he was kind enough not to say so. We stayed with Frank for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he offered to drive us back to the cabin in his old truck to collect our things. I was reluctant, but I'd left most of our belongings there, including our only vehicle. When we pulled up to the clearing where our cabin stood, or rather where it had stood, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The cabin was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. The roof had partially collapsed inward, as if something massive had pushed down on it from above. The front door was ripped from its hinges and lay 20 feet from the entrance. Windows were shattered. Our supplies, food, clothing, tools, were scattered across the clearing, as if someone had ransacked the place and thrown things in a rage. But it was the walls that truly terrified me. Some of the logs, massive, heavy logs, that had taken my father and 2 other men to position when building the cabin, had been pushed inward, buckling the entire structure. These weren't logs that could be moved by a bear or even several bears. It would have taken something of enormous strength, working deliberately, to cause that kind of damage. Frank and I cautiously approached the wreckage. My son stayed in the truck, too frightened to get out. As we got closer, I noticed deep gouges in the wood, claw marks or something similar, far larger and deeper than anything a bear could make. And then I saw the drag marks in the dirt around the cabin, long, deep furrows in the soil, as if something heavy had been dragged away from the cabin and into the forest. We followed them to the edge of the trees and stopped. Neither of us wanted to go any further. "What the hell could do something like this?" Frank muttered, more to himself than to me. I didn't answer. I knew. It was the same creature I'd seen as a child, the same one my sister had encountered, but now it wasn't just watching, it was claiming its territory. Our family had been living on its land for decades, and it had finally had enough. We quickly gathered what belongings we could salvage, threw them in the truck and left. I never returned to the property. Eventually, I sold my share to a logging company. I don't know what happened to the creature, whether it's still there or if it moved on when the loggers came in. What haunts me most isn't just the destruction itself, but the deliberate nature of it. This wasn't random animal damage. This was methodical, intentional. It was a message. This is my land. You are not welcome here. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've read about Bigfoot and Sasquatch encounters, and some details match, but the level of aggression we experience seems unusual. Most reports describe these creatures as shy, avoiding humans when possible. Whatever it was that destroyed our cabin that night in '74, it wasn't shy. It was territorial, intelligent and powerful beyond belief, and it made damn sure we knew we were trespassing. A tune. Story 3. I've been sitting on this story for a while now, hesitant to share it because I know how it sounds. But after reading similar accounts here, I finally feel like someone might actually believe me. This happened in May 2022, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My best friend Jaden and I had just turned 17, and we were both planning to enlist in the Army after high school. We thought it would be smart to test our outdoor skills before basic training, so we planned this week-long camping trip in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest near Packwood, Washington. We weren't exactly rookies. We'd both been camping with our dads since we were kids, but this was our first time completely on our own. No adults. We drove out early on a Saturday morning in my beat-up Jeep Cherokee, packed with way too much gear. Looking back, we were probably overconfident, thinking we were tougher than we actually were. We wanted to get deep into the wilderness, away from other campers and tourists. We hiked about 4 miles from where we parked, following this small creek until we found this perfect clearing. It had flat ground for our tents, trees for cover, and the creek for water. It felt secluded but not too isolated, at least that's what we thought. We spent that first day setting up camp, gathering firewood, and exploring the immediate area. The forest was gorgeous, towering pines, moss-covered everything, that distinct Pacific Northwest smell of damp earth and pine needles. We even spotted a few deer and took some pictures. By late afternoon, we had our tents up, a decent fire pit built, and food stored properly. Everything was going exactly as planned. As the sun went down, we cooked some freeze-dried meals on our portable stove and sat around the fire, talking about high school graduation coming up, our plans for the military, just normal teenage stuff. The night was clear, and we could see the stars through the gaps in the tree canopy. It was peaceful, perfect even, until about 9:30. I remember checking my watch because Jaden had just mentioned how early we should get up the next day for fishing. That's when we heard it, branches breaking in the forest behind my tent. At first, I thought it was just a deer or something, but then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps that made the ground vibrate slightly. "You hear that?" Jaden whispered, his eyes wide. I nodded and we both went silent, listening. The footsteps continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of our campsite. Whatever it was big, and it was circling us, not coming closer, not moving away, just circling. We weren't totally unprepared for wildlife. I had brought my dad's shotgun, and Jaden had his grandfather's old M1 rifle. We'd packed them mostly for target shooting and honestly to feel like badasses. But now I was grateful we had them. I grabbed the shotgun while Jaden reached for the M1. "Hey!" I shouted into the darkness. "We know you're there! We're armed!" Part of me was hoping it was just some hiker trying to mess with us, but the footsteps didn't stop or change pattern. They just continued, methodically moving around us. I could hear branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed under significant weight. "Should we fire a warning shot?" Jaden asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure it was a good idea. "On 3, we counted down, and I fired the shotgun into the air, away from the direction of the sounds. The blast echoed through the forest, and for a moment, everything went dead silent. I felt a surge of relief, thinking whatever it was had been scared off. Then the footsteps resumed, slow, deliberate, unfazed. Jaden fired his M1 next, another warning shot. Again, a brief pause, and then the circling continued. That's when the fear really set in. This wasn't normal animal behavior. Bears, mountain lions, even wolves, they don't circle like that, especially not after warning shots, and they certainly don't continue after 2 loud gunshots. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some drunken campers trying to scare us. But deep down, I knew no person would keep circling after we fired weapons. It just didn't make sense. For almost 2 hours, this thing continued circling our camp. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, and we'd think it was gone, but then it would resume again from a different position. It never came into the light of our fire, staying just beyond where our visibility ended. Around 11:30, Jaden whispered, "We need to get out of here." I nodded. We quickly grabbed our backpacks, the guns, our phones, and the car keys. We left everything else, the tents, sleeping bags, cooking gear, all of it. Our only goal was to get back to the Jeep as fast as possible. We used our flashlights and moved quickly, practically jogging. The whole time I kept looking back, convinced we were being followed, but I never saw anything, just trees and darkness. The 4-mile hike back to the car took us less than an hour, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. When we reached the road, there was no way we were sleeping in the car, too exposed. We ended up finding this drainage ditch about half a mile down the road, crawled in with our backpacks, and spent the most uncomfortable night of my life, taking turns staying awake to keep watch. As the sun came up, we both felt stupid. In the daylight, our fears from the night before seemed overblown. We debated what to do: go home with our tails between our legs or go back for our gear. Our pride won out. We couldn't just abandon hundreds of dollars worth of camping equipment because we got spooked. So we hiked back to our campsite, half expecting to find everything destroyed or stolen. But when we arrived, nothing had been touched. The tents were intact, the fire pit undisturbed, our food still hanging from the tree where we'd left it. It was as if nothing had happened. We looked for tracks around the camp, but found nothing conclusive. Just broken branches and some disturbed undergrowth that could have been caused by anything. Yet we both knew what we'd heard. "I don't want to stay here another night," I admitted. "Me neither," Jaden agreed. "But I don't want to go home either. What about that old campground we passed about 2 miles back? It's more open, and maybe being in a designated area would be safer." It seemed like a good compromise. We packed up our gear and hiked to the old campground. It was early in the season, so the place was empty. We chose a spot in the middle of the clearing, far from the tree line. We set everything up again and spent the day fishing and hiking, trying to convince ourselves that last night was just our imaginations running wild. That evening, we built a bigger fire than necessary, both for the light and the psychological comfort. We cooked dinner and tried to act normal, but every snap of a twig made us jump. As darkness fell, we kept the conversation going, as if the sound of our voices would keep away whatever had circled us the previous night. Around 8 o'clock, I was in the middle of telling this stupid story about our math teacher when Jaden's face went completely white. He was looking over my shoulder toward the edge of the campground. "Caleb," he whispered, "don't move. Just slowly turn around." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. Slowly, I turned. About 50 feet away, at the edge of the tree line, stood something huge. In the twilight, I could make out a large, upright figure, probably 8 or 9 feet tall. It had dark hair covering its body and long arms that hung down past its knees. But what struck me most was how it just stood there, watching us, not moving, not threatening, just observing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like my mind was rejecting the reality in front of me. "Is that a bear?" I finally managed, knowing full well it wasn't. "Bears don't stand like that," Jaden whispered back. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds, we stared at each other, us and this creature. Then, with a deliberate slowness, it turned and walked into the forest. Not on all fours like a bear, but upright, like a person. Its movement was smooth, almost graceful despite its size. Once it disappeared into the trees, Jaden and I both exhaled like we'd been holding our breath underwater. "What the fuck was that?" I hissed. I think we just saw a Sasquatch," Jaden said, his voice trembling. "Under normal circumstances, I would have laughed at him. Bigfoot isn't real, right? That's what I'd always thought. But I couldn't deny what I'd just seen with my own eyes. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. We debated what to do next. The logical choice was to pack up immediately and leave, but a strange determination came over us. We had seen something that most people would never believe. We needed evidence. "One more night," I said. "We stay one more night. We keep the cameras ready. If it comes back, we get a picture or a video." Jaden reluctantly agreed, though I think we were both running on a mixture of fear and fascination at that point. We took the guns out of their cases and kept them close. Neither of us mentioned that the guns had done nothing to deter whatever was circling us the night before. We stayed up late, talking in low voices, cameras and phones ready. But nothing happened. By midnight, we were exhausted, and the adrenaline crash was hitting hard. We decided to take shifts sleeping. I took the first watch while Jaden crawled into his tent. It was around 1 in the morning when I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no rustling leaves, no distant owl hoots, nothing. Just absolute, unnerving silence. I nudged Jaden's tent with my foot, and he emerged immediately, looking groggy but alert. "Listen," I whispered. "Nothing." He tilted his head, then his eyes widened as he registered the unnatural quiet. That's when the first rock landed. It hit about 10 feet from our fire, a small one, about the size of a golf ball. Then another, slightly larger, landed closer to us. "What the?" Jaden started, but was cut off by a third rock, this one the size of a softball, hitting a nearby tree with enough force to splinter some bark. We both stood now, guns in hand, scanning the darkness beyond our firelight. The rocks continued, landing all around us but never hitting us directly. It felt like they were being thrown with precision, deliberately missing us while sending a clear message. And then, for just a moment, it stepped into the edge of the firelight, just for a second or two, but long enough for us to see it clearly. Tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair. But most disturbingly, its eyes caught the firelight and seemed to glow, reflecting the flames like a cat's eyes would. It stepped back into the darkness, but I could feel it watching us. The rock throwing continued for another 10 minutes, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence remained for another hour before the normal forest sounds gradually returned. Neither of us slept that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we packed up our gear in record time and hiked back to my Jeep. We drove home in silence for most of the way, both trying to process what we'd experienced. "We're never telling anyone about this," Jaden finally said as we neared Packwood. "No one would believe us anyway," I replied. "But the thing is, I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something intelligent enough to use intimidation tactics to drive us away from its territory. It could have hurt us if it wanted to. Those rocks could have easily hit us, but it chose not to. I'm 20 now, getting ready to finish my first contract with the Army. Jaden and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes, when we get together on leave, the conversation inevitably turns to those nights in Gifford Pinchot. We never went back to that forest, and I don't think we ever will. I still can't explain what we encountered. All I know is that there's something out there in those woods, something intelligent, something powerful, something that most people would call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And it was real. As real as the keyboard I'm typing on right now. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just sharing what happened because I need someone else to know. And maybe, if you're planning a camping trip to Gifford Pinchot, you might want to reconsider, or at least bring more than a shotgun and an old M1 rifle. Because trust me, when you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist, no amount of firepower makes you feel safe. Story 4. It was fall of 1990, and I was just 10 years old. My cousin Daryl was staying with us for the weekend. We were basically inseparable when we got together. My family lived in a house near Avenue R12 and 35th Street East in Palmdale. If you know the area, it's kinda where civilization starts to give way to the high desert. Our backyard backed up against other properties with just simple wooden fences separating us from our neighbors. That night started like any other. My parents were watching TV in the living room, and Daryl and I were in my room playing Nintendo. It must have been around 8 or 8:30 when we first noticed the sounds. At first, it was just a weird scratching noise coming from outside. We ignored it initially. Could have been anything, maybe a raccoon or coyote. They'd sometimes wander into yards looking for food. But then the noises changed. There was this weird huffing sound, like heavy breathing, but deeper than any person or dog I'd ever heard. Then soft footsteps, except they weren't soft at all. Each step had this weight to it that seemed to vibrate through the house. I remember looking at Daryl, and he was already looking at me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, pausing our game. We sat completely still listening. There it was again, something moving around the perimeter of our house. It wasn't frantic like an animal, but deliberate, methodical, like whatever it was checking our house out. After about 20 minutes of this, curiosity got the better of us. The sounds seemed to be coming from the backyard now. I grabbed my dad's big Maglite flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. That thing was heavy, nearly the size of my forearm, but I felt safer holding it. "Should we tell your parents?" Daryl asked. I shook my head. "They'll just say we're imagining things." My dad wasn't the type to humor kids' stories, and I wanted to prove there was really something out there. We slipped out the back door onto our patio. The desert night was cool and quiet, except for that strange huffing sound, now coming from the far corner of our yard. I clicked on the flashlight, and we moved together across the concrete patio to the edge where our yard began. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the fence line. That's when we heard it. A shift in the dirt on the other side of the fence. Something big, moving slowly. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, and time just stopped. On the other side of our 6-foot fence stood something I still struggled to describe. The flashlight beam hit it right in the chest, which means its head and shoulders were well above our fence. Way above. This thing was massive, at least 9 feet tall. I could only see the upper body clearly, but what I saw wasn't human. Its eyes caught the light first, amber-colored and reflective, like a cat's but much larger. They seemed to glow with an internal light as they stared directly at us. The face was flat and wide, framed by light brown hair, almost dark blonde, that hung down around what I guess you'd call its shoulders. It had a heavy brow that shadowed those terrifying eyes, and a wide nose that looked almost squashed against its face. The body was just enormous, broader than any person I'd ever seen, covered in the same light brown hair. I remember thinking it must have weighed 500 or 600 pounds at least. Its arms hung at its sides, unnaturally long, with massive hands that dangled past where a person's knees would be. The worst part was how still it stood. It didn't run or attack or even make a sound. It just watched us, breathing those deep, huffing breaths that we'd been hearing. Steam rose from its mouth in the cool night air. I swear I could smell it too. A musty, wild odor that stung my nostrils. Daryl and I stood frozen for what felt like forever but was probably only a few seconds. Then, like someone had flipped a switch in both our brains, we turned and ran. I don't even remember dropping the flashlight, but I must have because my hands were empty when we burst through the back door. "Dad! Dad!" I was screaming at the top of my lungs. "There's something in the yard." My parents came running, obviously alarmed by our panic. We were both hysterical, talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. It was huge. Its eyes were glowing. It was looking right at us, taller than the fence. My dad tried to calm us down, but we were inconsolable. Finally, he grabbed his shotgun from the closet and went out to investigate, telling us and my mum to stay inside. I remember watching through the window, terrified that this thing would hurt my dad. He was out there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. When he came back in, he looked confused, not scared. "There's nothing out there now, boys. Whatever you saw must have moved on." "Did you check behind the miller's fence?" I insisted. "That's where it was standing." My dad just shook his head. "It's dark, Tom. I'm not going into someone else's yard at night. We'll check it out in the morning." My mum suggested it was probably just a bear, though bears weren't common in our area. My dad nodded along, eager to dismiss our story as an overactive imagination. They sent us to bed with assurances that we were safe, but neither Daryl nor I slept that night. We pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom door and kept the lights on till dawn. The next morning, my dad must have seen how shaken we still were, because he finally agreed to check the spot properly. We led him to where we'd been standing and pointed to the exact spot on the other side of the fence where the creature had stood. What he found made his face go pale. In the sandy soil on the other side of the fence were two enormous impressions. Footprints, I guess you'd call them, though they weren't shaped exactly like human feet. They were huge, at least 18 inches long, and sunk deep into the hard desert soil. Whatever had made them had to have been incredibly heavy. My dad didn't say much after that. He took some photos with his Polaroid camera and spent the rest of the day reinforcing our fence and checking the locks on all our doors and windows. He never admitted we'd seen what we claimed, but he never dismissed us again either. For years afterward, I couldn't go outside at night. Even as a teenager, I'd feel that primal fear creep up my spine any time I heard an unusual sound after dark. The worst part was, nobody believed us. Not our friends, not our teachers, not even other family members. My dad kept those Polaroids in his desk drawer, but never showed them to anyone else. It was like this terrible secret our family carried. As I got older, I learned to stop talking about it. I joined the army straight out of high school, then became a police officer, and eventually a federal agent. In those professions, you can't afford to be the guy who claims he saw Bigfoot as a kid. So I buried it deep and pretended it never happened. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand 9 feet tall on their hind legs for minutes at a time, staring unblinking at terrified children. It wasn't a person in a suit. No costume could replicate the mass, the proportions, or those eyes. Those eyes that seemed to look right through me. Years later, when I was in my 30s, I finally worked up the courage to research what I'd seen. I found reports of similar sightings in the high desert regions of Southern California, stretching back decades. People described the same creature, tall, massive, with light-colored hair. Some called it Sasquatch, others Bigfoot. The names didn't matter to me. I just needed to know I wasn't crazy. One night, about 5 years ago, I was visiting my parents' house with my wife, Sheila. My dad had gotten ill, and we were helping my mom take care of him. After my dad fell asleep, my mom pulled out an old shoebox from the top of her closet. "I think you should have these," she said, handing it to me. Inside were those Polaroids my dad had taken the morning after our encounter, along with a journal I'd never seen before. In it, my dad had documented our experience in detail, including measurements of the footprints and sketches of what Daryl and I had described seeing. There were also notes about other strange occurrences around our property in the months following, unusual sounds in the night, missing pets in the neighborhood, a mangled section of fence that was inexplicably torn down. The last entry was dated almost a year after our sighting. "I saw it tonight, standing at the edge of the property, watching the house. The boys were right. God help us, they were right." My dad passed away 2 weeks later, taking with him whatever else he might have known or seen. Since then, Sheila and I have had our own strange experiences near our home in Tulare. Sounds in the night that can't be explained. Glimpses of something large moving through the trees at the edge of our property. Once, a set of those same massive footprints in the mud after a rainstorm. I've never gone looking for answers. Part of me doesn't want to know what's out there, but I know what I saw that night in 1990. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I could identify. Whatever it was intelligent enough to investigate our home, curious enough to watch us, and deliberate enough to keep its distance. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the shadows. I wonder if it remembers the 2 terrified boys who shone a light in its face 30 years ago. I wonder if it's watching me still. All I know for sure is that something exists in the wilderness of this country that science hasn't classified. Something that walks upright like a man but isn't a man. Something with intelligence behind those amber eyes. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days, I wish I could convince myself it was just my imagination. But then night falls, and I hear something moving outside my window, and I know in my bones that what Daryl and I saw that night in Palmdale was real. And I know I'll never forget those eyes staring at me from above our fence, seeing right through me like I was nothing more than prey. Those eyes that still find me in my nightmares, even now. Story 5. I've hesitated to share this experience for almost 2 years now. I'm not the type who goes looking for attention or believes in mythical creatures. At 62 years old, I've spent most of my life hiking, fishing, and hunting in the Pacific Northwest. I know what bears look like when they stand up. I know what elk sound like moving through brush. What I saw that day in June of 2021 was neither of those things. For context, I had undergone hip replacement surgery about 4 months prior. By June, I was finally feeling comfortable enough to get back to some light fishing. Nothing strenuous, just standing at the riverbank for a few hours. My physical therapist had actually encouraged it as good recovery exercise. So on that Tuesday morning, June 8th, if I remember correctly, I drove out to one of my favorite spots along the North Fork of the Snoqualmie River. The weather was mild that day, overcast but not raining, around 65 degrees. Perfect fishing weather. I arrived around 8 in the morning, parked my truck at the small clearing about 50 yards from the riverbank, and carefully made my way down with my gear. I was still using a walking stick for stability on uneven ground, moving slower than I used to. It took me about 15 minutes just to get set up, which would have taken 5 before the surgery. The spot I chose was a somewhat secluded bend in the river, where I'd had luck catching rainbow trout in previous years. The water was running clear, but high from the late spring melt-off. Across the river, the bank rose steeply about 30 feet, covered in dense fir, hemlock, and underbrush. Standard Washington forest terrain. I hadn't seen another person all morning, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. I settled in, getting into that peaceful rhythm of casting and retrieving, listening to the rushing water, watching osprey circling overhead. For the first time since my surgery, I felt normal again, just a man enjoying some quiet fishing. That sense of normalcy wouldn't last long. About 15 minutes into my fishing, I heard it. A loud, distinctive crack from across the river. Not a gunshot, but the unmistakable sound of wood breaking under significant weight. The sound echoed slightly in the river valley. My first thought was that it was a dead tree finally giving way. But it didn't have that prolonged cracking and crashing you'd hear when a tree falls. It was a single sharp break, like something heavy had suddenly snapped a thick branch. Being in bear country, I immediately thought it must be a black bear moving through the trees across the river. I wasn't particularly concerned. The river was about 40 feet wide at that point, and bears typically avoid humans. Still, I kept my eyes on the far bank while continuing to fish. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes passed before I heard another crack, sharper and closer to the water's edge. This one made me pause. I set my rod against a nearby rock and reached for my binoculars from my vest pocket. The far bank was steep but not vertical, covered in thick vegetation with occasional gaps where game trails cut through. I scanned slowly, looking for movement. That's when I saw it, and even now, typing this makes my heart race. Through a narrow gap in the vegetation, maybe 20 feet above the waterline, something large moved from right to left across my field of view. Something walking upright. The sighting lasted perhaps 3 seconds at most as it crossed that gap, but what I saw is burned into my memory. Wide, sloping shoulders, easily twice the width of a large man. A barrel-like chest, dark, either black or dark brown. The shadow from the trees made it hard to tell. What struck me most was the complete absence of a neck. The head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. I want to be completely clear. This was not a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in my decades outdoors. Bears, even when walking on hind legs, have a distinctive gait and proportion. This moved with deliberate, smooth strides, bipedal but with a slightly forward lean. The movement was controlled and eerily silent for something so massive. No crashing through undergrowth, no difficulty navigating the steep terrain, just smooth, purposeful movement. I stood frozen, binoculars still raised long after it disappeared from view. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Could it have been another hiker in dark clothes? Absolutely not. No human has that build or moves like that. A bear? No way. The proportions were all wrong, and the movement pattern didn't match. After a minute or so of standing there, I realized my hands were shaking. I looked down at my fishing rod, then back at the far bank. Whatever I had seen was impressive enough that fishing suddenly seemed irrelevant. I needed to know more. I needed to see it again. I quickly packed up my gear, which wasn't easy with my recovering hip and trembling hands. I kept glancing across the river, half expecting to see the figure emerge again, but the forest remained still. Using my walking stick, I made my way back to my truck, moving as fast as my hip would allow, which wasn't very fast at all. My plan was to drive upstream about a quarter mile, where I knew there was a Forest Service road that crossed to the other side. From there, I could get closer to where I had seen the figure. It took about 10 minutes to drive around, navigating the rutted dirt road carefully. My truck isn't a heavy-duty off-road vehicle, just a standard Ford F-150, and I had to take it slow to avoid bottoming out in some of the deeper potholes. I parked at a small turnout and sat there for a moment, considering what I was about to do. I'm not an impulsive person by nature, especially since the surgery had me moving more cautiously. If what I saw was what I was starting to believe it was, a Sasquatch, then was I really prepared to follow it? On the other hand, how many opportunities would I ever have to potentially confirm something that most people dismiss as legend? I grabbed my walking stick, a small backpack with water and a first aid kit, and most importantly, my camera. I didn't have a fancy DSLR or anything, just my Samsung phone, but it was better than nothing. The terrain on this side was even steeper and more challenging than where I'd been fishing. With my limited mobility, I knew I couldn't go far, but I hoped to at least get to a vantage point where I might spot the figure again. The going was slow and difficult. Every step on the uneven ground sent little jolts of discomfort through my hip. My physical therapist would have had a fit if she could see me. I had to stop frequently to catch my breath and rest my leg. After about 20 minutes of careful hiking, I reached a point where I could see across to approximately where I'd been fishing earlier. I found a fallen log, brushed off some moss, and sat down to watch and listen. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. Just the distant sound of the river below. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes silent, it usually means something has disturbed the natural order, typically a predator. I sat completely still, scanning the tree line, looking for any movement. After about 45 minutes of nothing, the regular forest sounds gradually returned. Birds started calling again. A squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby tree. Whatever had been there had either left the area or was now perfectly still. Given my limited mobility and the deteriorating weather, clouds were darkening, suggesting rain was coming, I reluctantly decided to head back to my truck. The return journey was even slower than the hike-in. My hip was aching fiercely now, reminding me that I had pushed well beyond what my doctor would have recommended. I used my walking stick heavily, carefully placing each step to avoid slipping on the increasingly damp ground. About halfway back to the truck, I stopped to rest on a stump and take some ibuprofen from my pack. As I sat there, catching my breath, I heard it. a long, low vocalization coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, in the direction I'd been watching. It wasn't a howl or a scream like you hear described in some Bigfoot reports. It was almost like a deep, resonant humming that gradually decreased in pitch. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then silence returned. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. Whatever made that sound was big. The depth and resonance spoke to a massive chest cavity, something far larger than a human. It wasn't a bear sound, it wasn't an elk bugle. It was unlike anything I'd heard in my decades of wilderness experience. I should have been terrified, but strangely I wasn't. I felt alert, certainly, but also incredibly curious. I strained to hear more, but nothing came. After waiting another 10 minutes, I reluctantly continued back to my truck, the sound replaying in my mind. By the time I reached my vehicle, light rain had started to fall. I sat in the truck for a while, windows fogging up, trying to process what I had experienced. Part of me wanted to wait it out, to see if the creature would emerge in the open. But reason prevailed. The rain was intensifying, my hip was throbbing, and pushing my luck in these conditions seemed foolish. As I drove home that afternoon, I kept replaying the 3-second sighting in my mind. The smooth, deliberate movement, the massive shoulders, the way it navigated the steep terrain with apparent ease, the strange vocalization that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I've spent most of my life as a practical person. I worked 40 years as a mechanical engineer before retiring. I approach problems logically, look for rational explanations. Before that day, if you'd asked me about Bigfoot, I probably would have said it was an interesting piece of folklore, but not something I put much stock in. Now, I don't know what to think. I've gone over it countless times in my mind, tried to convince myself it was just a bear, just a person in dark clothes, just my imagination. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and none of the conventional explanations fit. In the weeks following, I researched Sasquatch sightings in the Snoqualmie area. Turns out there have been dozens reported over the years, many with details strikingly similar to what I experienced. I even found reports of that same humming vocalization. I've only told 3 people about this: my wife, my brother, who's also an outdoorsman, and my oldest friend. My wife is supportive but skeptical. My brother believes me without question. He had his own strange experience in the Olympic National Forest back in the 90s that he's never been able to explain. My friend thinks I probably saw a bear, and my mind filled in the rest. Maybe he's right. Maybe at 62, recovering from surgery, a bit unsteady on my feet, I misinterpreted what I saw. But I don't think so. I've been around bears all my life. I know what they look like, how they move. This was something else entirely. I've returned to that same fishing spot 4 times since then. Part of me hopes for another sighting, a chance to maybe get a photo this time. Part of me hopes I never see it again. The encounter has left me with an unsettled feeling, a sense that the wilderness I thought I knew so well still holds mysteries beyond my understanding. What keeps coming back to me isn't fear, but a profound sense of privilege. If what I saw was indeed a Sasquatch, and I believe it was, then I'm one of the relatively few people who have had a direct encounter with a creature that most of the world dismisses as myth. There's something humbling about that. I don't expect everyone to believe my account. I probably wouldn't have believed it myself 2 years ago, but I know what I saw that day on the Snoqualmie River, and I'll never look at those forests the same way again. Story 6. I've been a hunter for 27 years, and I've never been afraid of the woods until 2015. I grew up in rural Washington state, spent my whole life learning the forests, the mountains, the signs of animals. My dad taught me to hunt when I was 12, and I've gone every season without fail. I've tracked bears, confronted cougars, weathered storms in makeshift shelters, normal stuff for anyone who spends real time in the backcountry. But what happened last fall near Mount Adams changed everything. I've kept this mostly to myself until now. My wife knows parts of it, And I tried telling a close buddy once, but he just laughed it off. I need to get this out because I still can't sleep right some nights when I hear noises outside our property. It was early October, perfect hunting weather. Cool enough for the elk to be moving, but not so cold that you freeze your ass off waiting for them. I'd taken 3 days off work to do a solo hunt in a remote area on the western slopes of Mount Adams. It's beautiful country, old-growth forest mixed with meadows, lots of game trails, not many people. I'd been successful there before, so I was hopeful about my chances. I parked my truck at this little-used Forest Service road around 5 a.m. and hiked in about 4 miles before first light. The plan was to get set up near a small stream where I'd seen elk crossing in previous seasons. I was traveling light, just my .308 rifle, day pack with essentials, my knife, some jerky and water. The morning passed without much action. I spotted some deer tracks, saw a few grouse, but no sign of the elk I was after. Around noon, I decided to move to higher ground where I could glass the surrounding area. Found a decent spot on a ridge that gave me good visibility of a small valley below, ate a quick lunch and settled in to watch. Around 2 in the afternoon, I caught movement at the edge of a clearing maybe 200 yards down the slope. I raised my binoculars. It was a deer, a small doe. Not what I was after, but it was good to see movement. I watched her for a few minutes as she nervously poked around, ears constantly twitching. Then she suddenly bolted. Not unusual, deer spook easily, but I kept scanning, hoping maybe she'd sensed a bull elk nearby. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, I spotted a nice-sized elk moving through the trees, just beyond where the deer had been. 5-point bull at least, moving cautiously through the underbrush. Perfect. I slowly got into position, checked the wind, blowing toward me, good, and started to make my way downhill. The terrain was steep but manageable, lots of tree cover to keep me hidden as I stalked closer. I moved as quietly as 20 years of experience had taught me, stepping on roots, not leaves, testing each foothold before putting my weight down, keeping my breathing steady. After about 15 minutes of careful movement, I was maybe 300 yards from where I'd last seen the elk. I stopped behind a large Douglas fir to listen and caught the sound of movement ahead. Through a gap in the trees, I spotted the elk again, closer now, maybe 100 yards away. I raised my rifle, found him in the scope, and was about to squeeze the trigger when he suddenly jerked his head up, alert. Before I could take the shot, the elk bolted, crashing through the underbrush away from me. I lowered my rifle, frustrated but not surprised. They've got senses way better than ours. I figured he'd either caught my scent somehow or heard me. That's when I noticed something else moving. About 50 feet beyond where the elk had been standing, something large was moving through the trees. And it wasn't moving like any animal I recognized. It was bipedal, moving upright, but fast, really fast. It was partially obscured by trees, but I could tell it was big, way bigger than a person. I raised my scope again, trying to get a better look. The rifle scope gave me a clearer view than my binoculars would have, but what I saw still didn't make sense. It was covered in dark brown fur, and there seemed to be moss or vegetation tangled in it. The creature moved behind a stand of trees before I could get a clear look at its face, but I caught a glimpse of a massive shoulder and arm as it disappeared from view. I stood there, frozen. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3 seconds. I told myself it had to be another hunter, maybe wearing one of those ghillie suits. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No hunter moves that fast through thick forest, and it was huge, well over 7 feet tall. I stayed put for several minutes, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there, but another part, the stubborn, curious part, wanted to know what I'd just seen. After convincing myself I wasn't in immediate danger, I cautiously moved forward toward where the creature had been. The forest felt different now. I've spent thousands of hours in the woods, and you develop a sense for when things aren't right. Birds had gone quiet. The air felt heavy, tense. I kept my rifle ready as I moved, eyes scanning constantly. I reached the spot where the elk had been standing. The ground was torn up from when it bolted, fresh tracks showing where it had pushed off. But beyond that, where the creature had been, the signs were strange. Broken branches higher up than an elk could reach, disturbed undergrowth that didn't match any usual game trail pattern. As I was examining the area, I heard voices, not far off, maybe a couple 100 yards west of me. I moved cautiously in that direction and came across 3 other hunters, older guys in their 50s or 60s, taking a break on some fallen logs. "Any luck?" one of them called out when he spotted me. I shook my head and approached them. "Not yet. You guys see anything unusual today?" I asked, trying to sound casual. They looked at each other, then back at me. "Just some deer," one said. "Why? What did you see?" I hesitated. "Not sure. Thought I saw something big moving through the trees, but lost sight of it." The oldest of the group chuckled. "Probably that bull elk we jumped earlier. Big bastard." I nodded, not willing to share more. They hadn't seen anything unusual, and I wasn't about to start talking about what I thought I might have seen. We chatted for a few more minutes. Normal hunter talk about the weather, the terrain, where they'd had luck in previous years. They were heading back to their camp, having been out since dawn. I told them I was going to continue for a couple more hours. After we parted ways, I should have headed back toward my truck. The smart move would have been to call it a day, but I didn't. Instead, I circled back to where I'd seen the creature disappear. The broken branches and disturbed vegetation made a clear trail once I started really looking. Whatever made it was moving fast and didn't care about being quiet. I followed cautiously, rifle ready, stopping every few yards to listen. The trail led uphill toward a denser part of the forest with larger, older trees. About a quarter mile from where I'd first seen the creature, the trail of disturbance led to a massive, old-growth fir tree. Had to be 5 feet in diameter, and at its base, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint. Not a boot print, not a bear print, a footprint. It was partial, just the ball of a foot and what looked like the first 3 toes. The big toe was enormous, honestly about 4 times the size of my own. The impression was deep too, maybe 3 inches into the soil, which suggested whatever left it was incredibly heavy. I've tracked bear, cougar, elk, deer, everything that lives in these mountains. This wasn't anything I recognized. My mouth went dry as I knelt down to examine it more closely. The shape was unmistakably foot-like, but the size... It had to be at least 16 inches long, though I couldn't see the heel portion. I stood up, suddenly very aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the slight breeze through the trees and my own breathing, which I realized was coming faster now. I decided to keep going, following the direction the tracks seemed to lead. Maybe 20 yards further, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in a small clearing ahead, lay the elk I'd seen earlier. It was dead. But not just dead. It had been killed in a way I've never seen before. Its hind leg, the entire leg, had been torn off at the hip. Not cut, torn. The wound was ragged, with tissue and muscle hanging loose. The elk's neck was twisted backward at an impossible angle, clearly broken. Blood was still seeping into the ground beneath it. This was fresh. I've field-dressed hundreds of animals. I've seen wolf kills and cougar kills. This wasn't like those. The violence needed to tear a leg from an adult elk and break its neck like that. It's almost unimaginable. A grizzly might have the strength, but there haven't been confirmed grizzlies in this part of Washington for decades. And even a bear kill doesn't look like this. As I stood there, staring at the carcass, a feeling washed over me that I've never felt before or since in the woods. I was being watched. Not the vague awareness you sometimes get when a deer might be looking at you from cover or when you sense another hunter nearby. This was primal. Something intelligent was observing me, tracking my movements. My skin crawled. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. I've faced down a black bear at 30 yards without this level of fear. This was different, deep, instinctual terror. I slowly raised my rifle and turned in a complete circle, scanning the trees around me. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted, intensified even. Whatever had killed the elk might still be close, might be considering whether I'd make good prey too. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. You don't run from predators. I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes moving, my rifle ready. Each step felt like it took forever. The dead elk lay there, its eyes still open, staring at nothing. As I backed away, about 30 yards from the elk, I heard it, a deep rumbling sound from somewhere in the trees to my right. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt. Lower and more resonant than a bear. It was brief, just a few seconds, but it froze me in place. I swung my rifle toward the sound but saw nothing. The forest remained still. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 seconds, I continued backing away. Faster now, but still not running. When I'd put about 100 yards between myself and the elk carcass, I finally turned and began walking quickly, then jogging, back toward where I'd met the other hunters. I kept stopping to look and listen, but never saw anything following me. The feeling of being watched gradually faded as I put more distance between myself and that place. I made it back to the main trail and practically power walked the 4 miles to my truck. I didn't stop once, didn't look for game, didn't take breaks, just moved as fast as I could without running. It was nearly dark when I reached the truck. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to get the key in the ignition. I drove straight home, breaking the speed limit the whole way. My wife knew something was wrong the minute I walked in the door. I was pale, still shaking. I told her I'd had a close call with what might have been a bear, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the whole truth. How do you tell someone you think you saw a Sasquatch? That you found an elk killed with impossible violence? That you felt the most primal fear of your life? I've gone back and forth 1,000 times about what I saw that day. I never got a clear look at the creature's face, never saw a full body in plain view. But what I did see, the movement, the footprint, the killed elk, and that sound, it doesn't line up with anything known to live in those woods. I didn't go hunting at all last season, made excuses about my back acting up. The truth is, I'm scared. For the first time in my life, I'm afraid of the woods I've always loved. I've researched online, read accounts from others who claim to have seen similar things. Some of their descriptions match what I experienced. The silence, the feeling of being watched, the impossible strength. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Mount Adams. Sometimes I wonder if whatever I encountered that day is still there, hunting those forests. And sometimes on quiet nights when I hear something moving outside our rural property, I lie awake wondering if it followed me home. Story 7. I'm not even sure where to start with this. It's been over 2 months since it happened, and I'm still struggling to make sense of it. I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or monsters. I'm an accountant, for God's sake. Numbers, spreadsheets, logic, that's my world. Or it was, until this summer. My wife Sarah and I decided to spend a long weekend at my uncle's cabin near Gallatin National Forest in Montana. We both needed a break from work, and the idea of disconnecting for a few days seemed perfect. The cabin has been in our family for decades. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy one-room structure with a small kitchen area, a bathroom, and enough space for a bed and a couple of chairs. No cell service, no internet, just woods, quiet, and stars. The drive up started out like any other trip we'd taken there. We left our home in Bozeman early on a Friday morning in July. Sarah was excited. She'd brought her camera, planning to photograph wildlife and the incredible mountain views. The GPS stopped working about 20 miles out, but I knew the way. The last stretch is always a rough dirt road that winds through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching the clearing where the cabin sits. It was around 6:30 in the morning when we made that final turn onto the dirt road. The sun was up, but still low, filtering through the pines in these beautiful golden shafts. We had the windows down. The air was crisp and fresh, exactly what we'd come for. Sarah was talking about her plans for the weekend, wondering if we'd see any deer or maybe even a bear from a safe distance. Then the smell hit us. It was so sudden and so intense that I actually slowed the truck down involuntarily. At first I thought we'd hit an animal or were passing a dead one on the roadside. But this was different. It was like rotting meat, but mixed with this powerful musky odor, kind of like a wet dog, but 100 times stronger. Sarah covered her nose with her shirt and looked at me with wide eyes. "What is that?" she asked, her voice muffled through the fabric. I slowed the truck even more, scanning the sides of the road for a carcass, but there was nothing. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, standing just at the edge of the road, was something. I still struggle with how to describe it, because my brain didn't immediately process what I was seeing. It was upright, on 2 legs, which is why my first thought was hiker. But within seconds I realized no human looks like that. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, probably taller, completely covered in dark brown hair or fur that looked matted in some places. The proportions were all wrong for a person. Its arms hung down so low, almost to its knees. The shoulders were incredibly broad, and the head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, with barely any neck visible. The face is what I can't shake from my memory. It wasn't quite ape, wasn't quite human, somewhere horrifyingly in between. The skin on the face was darker than the fur, almost black, and I swear its eyes caught the morning light and reflected back red just for a moment. I hit the brakes, and the truck came to a stop about 30 yards from this thing. Sarah hadn't seen it yet. She was still focused on the smell, but when the truck stopped, she looked up and gasped. I remember her hand shooting out and grabbing my arm so hard it left marks. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, we just stared at each other, us in the truck, it on the roadside. It didn't seem aggressive or even particularly interested. It just looked at us, almost studying us. Then, with a deliberate calmness that was somehow more unsettling than if it had charged, it turned and walked into the brush at the side of the road. Not running, not hiding, just walking away like it had somewhere else to be. The brush was tall, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but this thing was so tall that I could still see its head and shoulders moving away for several seconds before the forest swallowed it completely. Sarah and I sat there in complete silence. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Finally, I turned to her and saw that her face had gone completely white. "Did you," I started. "Drive," she cut me off. "Just drive, Derek." I drove. The smell lingered for about a quarter mile, then faded. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to rationalize. Maybe a bear standing up. But bears don't walk upright with that smooth gait. A man in a suit, in the middle of nowhere at 6:30 in the morning? No way. When we reached the cabin, I think we both silently decided to try and move past it. We unloaded the truck, opened the windows to air the place out, and went through our usual routine of checking the generator and water pump. Sarah swept, while I wiped down the counters and table. We were going through the motions, keeping busy, not talking about what we'd seen. Around noon, I finally brought it up. We were sitting on the small porch, drinking coffee, when I said, "About what we saw this morning." Sarah's reaction surprised me. She's usually the more imaginative one between us, but she shut it down immediately. "I don't want to talk about it, Derek. It was probably just a bear or something." But I could see in her eyes she didn't believe that. Still, I didn't push. We spent the day hiking the trails near the cabin, staying much closer than we normally would, fishing at the small stream about a half-mile away, and preparing dinner. Every time we were in the woods, I felt on edge, constantly scanning between trees, jumping at every sound. Sarah did too, though she tried to hide it. As the day wore on, I started to feel a bit ridiculous. In the daylight, with birds singing and squirrels chattering, the forest felt normal again. By evening, we'd convinced ourselves we'd seen something unusual, but explainable. A bear with mange, maybe, or some weird optical illusion caused by the morning light. We made dinner on the old propane stove, played some cards, and opened a bottle of wine. By the time we were ready for bed around 11, we'd almost managed to laugh off the morning scare. Almost. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I first heard it, a sound of something moving through the underbrush outside. Lots of animals are active at night, so at first I didn't think much of it. But then came the footfalls. Heavy, deliberate steps crushing twigs and leaves. Not the four-footed pattern of a deer or bear. This was bipedal. 2 feet walking, circling the cabin. I turned off the bathroom light and stepped into the main room where Sarah was already sitting up in bed, eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, putting my finger to my lips. We listened as whatever it was completed a full circuit around the cabin. Then it stopped, somewhere near the front door. The silence was worse than the footsteps. Then, thud. Something hit the wall of the cabin with enough force to rattle the windows, not like a branch falling, but like something had struck it deliberately. Sarah jumped and grabbed my arm. Thud. Another impact, this time on the wall nearest to us. Thud, thud, thud. It was moving around the cabin again, striking the walls as it went. It sounded like powerful fists slamming into the structure. Not trying to break in, the cabin walls are solid logs, but making its presence known. I reached for the lantern on the bedside table and switched it off. We sat in total darkness, barely breathing. Sarah was trembling against me, and I wrapped my arm around her, trying to keep her quiet even as my own heart hammered in my chest. That's when we heard the breathing, deep, heavy breaths just outside the window, and beneath that, a low, rumbling growl that raised the hair on my arms. It wasn't a bear's growl. I've heard those before. This was different, lower, almost deliberate. Then came a new sound, tapping at the windows. Not the random pattering of rain or hail, but rhythmic, systematic. Tap, 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 moving from window to window around the cabin. I realized it was throwing small rocks or pebbles at the glass. Not hard enough to break the windows, but with clear purpose. Testing, probing, letting us know it was there. For nearly an hour, this continued. The footsteps, the wall striking, the window tapping, interspersed with periods of that horrible breathing sound. Sometimes it would move away into the forest, just far enough that we thought maybe it had gone. Then the footsteps would return, heavier and faster, like it was charging up to the cabin only to stop short of the walls. Sarah was silently crying now, her face buried in my shoulder. I was trying to think of what to do if it actually tried to get in. We had a hunting knife in the kitchen drawer and my uncle's old shotgun in the closet, but it wasn't loaded and the shells were in the truck. Around midnight, the sounds began to grow less frequent, more distant. The footsteps moved deeper into the forest. The breathing faded. One final thud against the farthest wall, so hard it seemed to shake the whole cabin. Then nothing. We sat in the dark for what must have been another hour, not daring to move, not daring to turn on a light. Eventually, I got up the courage to peek through a window. The moon was bright enough to see the clearing around the cabin, and there was nothing there. No shape, no movement, just trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I didn't sleep. Neither did Sarah. We sat on the bed, backs against the wall, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin, every rustle of wind in the trees outside. I kept the knife in my hand until my fingers cramped. As soon as the first grey light of dawn appeared, we were up and packing. We didn't speak, didn't need to. We threw our things into our bags haphazardly, not caring what got mixed up or left behind. I made a single trip to the outhouse with the shotgun in hand, scanning the tree line the entire time, seeing nothing but knowing, feeling that we were being watched. We loaded the truck in record time. The clearing looked normal in the morning light. No footprints that I could see, no obvious signs of our visitor. But when I walked around the cabin to lock up, I saw them, dents in the wooden walls where something had struck with incredible force. And beneath one window, a small pile of rocks, each about the size of a golf ball. The drive out was tense. Every shadow between the trees, every movement in the brush made us flinch. We barely spoke until we hit the main road, and even then it was just practical things. What time we'd be home, who would unpack. It wasn't until we were almost back to Bozeman that Sarah finally said, "It was the same thing from the morning, wasn't it?" It followed us. I nodded. I think it was marking its territory, warning us to leave. "It worked," she said quietly. Since that day, Sarah has refused to talk about what happened. She put away her hiking boots, cancelled her nature photography account online, and tenses up whenever anyone mentions camping or the woods. She says she doesn't remember it clearly, that it was probably just a bear or a mountain lion. But sometimes I catch her looking out the window at night with this expression of dread, like she's expecting to see a face looking back. I knew what we saw, what came back that night. I've spent hours researching online, reading accounts from others who've had similar experiences. I'm not crazy, and I wasn't hallucinating. There's something out there in those woods, something that walks on two legs but isn't human. Something intelligent enough to know how to frighten us away systematically. I called my uncle last week, making up some excuse about property boundaries, and casually asked if he'd ever experienced anything strange at the cabin. There was a long pause before he laughed it off, saying all forests seem spooky at night. But just before hanging up, he added, "Some places don't welcome visitors, Derek. Sometimes it's best to respect that." I don't know if I'll ever go back to that cabin. Part of me wants to, armed with cameras and recording equipment, to prove what I saw was real. But the larger part of me remembers those eyes reflecting red in the morning light, those powerful thuds against the cabin walls, that deliberate, intelligent attempt to frighten us away. And that smell. God, that smell. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can smell it again, that mixture of decay and musk. When that happens, I lie awake until morning, listening for heavy footsteps, for something circling our house. Because the most terrifying thought isn't just that it exists, it's that it found us once, and I can't shake the feeling that it remembers us. Story 8. I still can't believe it's been almost 5 months since it happened. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this now, except that it keeps replaying in my head at night when I'm trying to sleep. Maybe getting it all down will help me process what I saw that day. First off, I'm not some conspiracy nut or attention seeker. I've been mountain biking for 15 years, spent countless hours in backcountry wilderness, and I've never been the type to jump at shadows or make up stories. I'm a geological engineer by trade. I deal in measurable facts. But what I saw that Thursday afternoon in Banff has shaken that foundation. It was mid-September, perfect riding weather. The summer crowds had thinned out, temperatures were ideal, around 60 degrees with high clouds, and I had a rare Thursday off work. I'd been wanting to hit the Rundle Mountain Trail system all season but couldn't find the time. Anyone who rides there knows it's a gem, technical downhill sections with enough flow to make the climb worthwhile. I started early, around 7:30 in the morning, wanting to get a full day in. The first few hours were spectacular. I cleared some technical sections I'd struggled with in the past. The bike was performing flawlessly, and I felt strong. I stopped for lunch around 11, eating my sandwich at one of those scenic outlooks that makes you remember why you endure the grueling climbs. The Canadian Rockies stretched out before me, jagged and imposing against that impossibly blue Alberta sky. After lunch, I decided to do one more big loop before heading back. The trail I chose winds through a section of old-growth forest, before connecting to a more exposed ridge. The forest portion is dense, lots of spruce and pine, creating these dark, cathedral-like spaces between patches of sunlight. It's cooler there, quiet, except for your tires on dirt and the occasional bird call. It was around 1:30 in the afternoon when it happened. I was on a sweet downhill section, not bombing it, but moving at a good clip, maybe 15 miles per hour. My focus was on picking my line through some rooty sections when movement caught my eye off to my left. At first I thought it was just another rider, but then I realized it was a deer, a decent-sized doe, moving through the brush about 100 feet away. Something seemed off about the deer immediately. It was moving quickly, but not in a panicked sprint. More like it was trying to be stealthy while covering ground. What really struck me was how it kept looking back over its shoulder every few seconds, not in my direction, but further back in the woods. I've seen enough deer to know when they're spooked, and this one definitely was. I eased off my brakes a bit, still rolling downhill but slowing to get a better look. That's when my eyes drifted up in the direction the deer had been looking, about 300 feet away through a section where the trees thinned out a bit. My first thought was, hiker. There was a tall figure standing partially obscured by some brush. My brain immediately categorized it as human because what else would it be? But something seemed off about the proportions. I remember thinking it looked like someone wearing all black, which seemed strange for a hot day on a mountain trail where most hikers wear bright colors. Then it turned toward me. I still get chills remembering this moment. When it turned, I could clearly see its face, and in that instant I knew I wasn't looking at a person, not even close. The face had this weathered, leathery appearance, not like an elderly person, but like something that had endured decades of harsh wilderness living. Deep lines carved into the skin, prominently defined cheekbones, and a jaw that was unnaturally wide and square. The nose was broad and flat, almost pressed against the face, but it was the eyes that really got to me. Deep set under this massive brow ridge, dark and intensely alert. They didn't reflect light the way human eyes do. They absorbed it. Our eyes locked for maybe 2 seconds. 2 seconds that felt like an eternity, where my brain was frantically trying to categorize what I was seeing while simultaneously rejecting every possibility. Then it saw me. Its reaction was unlike anything I've ever witnessed. The moment it registered my presence, it dropped into this crouching position, not like a human crouch, but reminiscent of a deer coiling before it bolts. In one fluid motion, it made a sharp 90-degree turn and launched itself forward with both feet off the ground. The speed was impossible. I'm not exaggerating when I say it moved 2 to 3 times faster than an Olympic sprinter. It wasn't running so much as bounding. These powerful, explosive movements where it seemed to cover 8 or 10 feet per stride. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the denser part of the forest, moving with a level of agility that defied its size. Speaking of size, it wasn't gigantic like you see in some of those blurry photos people share online. I'd estimate it was around 6 feet tall, maybe slightly more. Slim but powerful looking, like a marathon runner rather than a bodybuilder. And it was completely black, not dark brown or grey, but black, which is partly why I initially thought it was wearing clothing. What struck me most was the intelligence in those movements. This wasn't some animal operating on instinct. There was calculation in how it assessed me and decided on its escape route. The movements were smooth, controlled, purposeful, like it knew exactly what it was doing and had done it countless times before. I pulled my bike to a complete stop, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. For several minutes, I just sat there, straddling my bike in the middle of the trail, trying to process what I'd seen. I kept scanning the forest, half expecting it to reappear, but there was nothing, just the typical forest sounds gradually returning after being briefly silenced. I debated continuing my ride versus heading back. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there, but another part was intensely curious. In the end, curiosity won, though I proceeded much more cautiously, stopping frequently to listen and scan my surroundings. About a quarter-mile further down the trail, I found something that made my skin crawl. The trail crossed a small, muddy section near a drainage area, and there, pressed clearly into the soft earth, was a footprint. Not a boot print, not a bare paw. A footprint that looked humanoid, but was all wrong. It was about 14 inches long, much narrower proportionally than a human foot, with toes that seemed longer and more spread out. The impression was deep, suggesting significant weight. I got off my bike and crouched down next to it. There was only the one clear print. The ground on either side was too rocky or plant-covered to hold impressions. I didn't have anything to measure it with precisely, but I placed my own boot, size 11, next to it, and this print was substantially larger. I took out my phone to snap a photo, and that's when I heard it. From somewhere in the forest came a sound that I can only describe as a wood knock, like someone taking a solid branch and striking it hard against a tree trunk. It was loud, deliberate, and definitely not a natural forest sound. It came from roughly the direction where I'd seen the figure disappear. That was enough for me. I pocketed my phone without taking the picture, something I've regretted every day since, jumped on my bike and rode out of there as fast as the trail would allow. I didn't stop until I reached a more open area where there were a few other hikers around. The ride back to my car was a blur of adrenaline and confusion. I kept going over what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs? No way. The proportions and movements were all wrong. A person in some kind of costume? Who would wear a full black suit in the backcountry, and no human could move with that explosive speed and agility? When I got back to my car, I sat there for a long time, hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. I debated whether to report what I'd seen. To who? The park rangers. What would I even say? I saw a Sasquatch. I could already imagine their faces. The polite skepticism, maybe concerns about whether I'd been drinking or using something. I ended up not reporting it officially, but I did search online for similar sightings in Banff National Park and was surprised to find quite a few accounts from over the years. Hikers, campers, even park employees who'd encountered something they couldn't explain. Several descriptions matched aspects of what I'd seen, particularly that weathered face and the incredible speed of movement. It's been 5 months now, and I've told exactly 3 people: my brother, my best friend, and my girlfriend. My brother was skeptical but supportive. My friend seemed to believe me but hasn't brought it up since. My girlfriend listened carefully and then asked if I'd been getting enough sleep lately. I've been back to Banff twice since then, but I haven't returned to that specific trail. Not out of fear exactly, but more a sense of respect. That thing, whatever it was, has survived there for who knows how long by avoiding human contact. If it wants to be left alone, I'll oblige. What stays with me most isn't just the shock of seeing something I thought was mythical. It's the face, that ancient weathered face that told a story of a hard life lived in the wilderness for decades. Those eyes held an awareness, an intelligence that was unsettling in its clarity. This wasn't just an animal, it was something that has been watching us from the shadows all along, something that knows more about surviving in those mountains than any human ever could. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Hell, there are moments I question it myself, but then I remember that face, those calculated movements, that impossible speed. And I know what I saw was real, not a legend, not a campfire story, but a living, breathing creature that shares our world while remaining almost completely hidden from it. Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about that deer, how it was moving cautiously, consistently looking back. It knew what was behind it. It had encountered this being before and understood exactly what it was dealing with. Maybe that's the most telling part of all. The wildlife knows they're out there, has always known. We're the ones in the dark. I still mountain bike several times a week, still love the backcountry. But now I pay closer attention to the shadows between the trees, to the silence that sometimes falls in the forest for no apparent reason. And I wonder how many times I've been watched by those deep-set eyes without ever knowing it. Story 9. I'm still struggling to make sense of what happened 3 weeks ago in the Little Belt Mountains. It's taken me this long to even write about it because, honestly, I wasn't sure if I should. People are going to think I'm crazy or making this up for attention, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. It was early August, just after the first weekend. My buddy C, Cassandra, and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We both needed to disconnect from work and our phones, so we decided on the Little Belt Mountains in Montana. There's an abandoned ski resort area there that we'd heard was beautiful in the summer, with some decent hiking trails and not many visitors. Perfect for a few days of peace and quiet. We'd been camping for about 3 days already, mostly just hanging out, cooking over the campfire and doing some light hiking. Nothing crazy. We're not exactly hardcore outdoorsy types, but we can handle ourselves. The weather had been perfect, warm during the day, cool at night, just how August in Montana should be. On our last day there, we decided to take one final hike before packing up. We'd been eyeing this trail that climbed up to some rocky outcroppings where we'd heard the view was incredible. It was a moderate hike, took us maybe 2 hours to get up there. By the time we reached the rocks, it was around 11 in the morning. The sun was high, barely any clouds, and the visibility was fantastic. We found a good spot on the rocks to take a break, eat some trail mix, and just soak in the view. From our position, we could see for miles across the forest below. There was a clear-cut area, maybe 350 yards away and about 500 feet down from where we were sitting. I remember joking with C about how people always complain about clear-cutting, but at that moment, it was giving us an awesome view. I was scanning the area with my binoculars, nothing fancy, just some Nikon 10x42s I've had for years, when I noticed what looked like a dark stump moving in that clear-cut section. At first, I figured it was just a shadow or maybe a black bear. We'd been warned there were bears in the area, so we'd been carrying bear spray the whole trip. "See, check this out," I said, handing her the binoculars. "Is that moving or am I seeing things?" She looked for a few seconds, then handed them back. "Probably just a bear, or a moose maybe." We kept watching it for about 10 minutes. It wasn't moving much, just kind of shifting around in the same spot. Then suddenly, this stump stood up, straight up, on 2 legs. My heart skipped. No bear stands up that tall or that straight, and it definitely wasn't a moose. This thing was huge, dark, and standing upright like a person, but much bigger. Before I could even say anything to C, I noticed a second figure appeared near the first one. This one was smaller and had this weird golden brown color, completely different from the dark one. "Are you seeing this?" C whispered. Her voice was shaking. "Yeah," was all I could manage to say. The smaller one started running around the bigger one, almost like a kid playing around a parent. It would bounce around, sometimes on all fours, sometimes upright, while the larger one just stood there, occasionally turning to watch it. Through the binoculars, I could make out more details. The big one had this weird triangular shape, broad shoulders that came down to a narrower waist. Its arms were really long, swinging a bit as it started to walk, but the weirdest thing was its head, or lack thereof. It didn't seem to have much of a neck. The head just sat right on those massive shoulders. "What the hell is that?" C whispered, grabbing the binoculars from me again. I didn't answer because I was afraid to say what I was thinking. The big one started walking through the grass, which looked to be about waist high on it. Every now and then, it would bend down, like it was picking something up or foraging. The little golden one kept bouncing around its legs, sometimes disappearing in the grass, only to pop up somewhere else. We sat there frozen, barely breathing. I remember my mouth was completely dry, and my hands were sweating so much that the binoculars kept slipping. Then the big one suddenly changed direction. It turned and started walking directly toward our position. Not running, just this purposeful stride. "Do you think it sees us?" C asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, "but I think we should stay very still." It covered ground fast with these massive strides. The golden one followed, keeping close to the big one now. They were maybe 200 yards away when they disappeared behind a patch of trees. We waited, not moving, barely breathing, for what felt like forever, but was probably 15 or 20 minutes. Nothing, no movement, no sound. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. "I think they're gone," I finally whispered. "Should we head back?" C asked. I could hear the fear in her voice. "Yeah, but slowly. Let's not draw attention." We packed our stuff as quietly as possible and started back down the trail. Every few steps I'd stop and listen. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? It was like that, but 100 times worse. We made it back to our campsite around 1 in the afternoon. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we'd seen, but we couldn't stop thinking about it either. After a tense lunch where we barely spoke, C finally broke the silence. "We should go back to that clearing," she said. I thought she was joking. "Are you serious? Why would we do that?" "Because if we don't, we're always going to wonder if we imagined it." She had a point. Plus, I had my .45 caliber Ruger in the truck. I hadn't brought it on our hike because we were trying to travel light. But if we were going back, I definitely wanted it with me. Not that I thought a handgun would do much against whatever those things were, but it was better than nothing. So around 3 that afternoon, we drove as close as we could get to the clear-cut area. It was about a half-mile walk from where we had to park. This time, every twig snap and rustle in the bushes made us jump. I had the Ruger in my hand the whole time, safety off, finger near the trigger. I'm not normally this jumpy in the woods, but after what we'd seen earlier, I wasn't taking any chances. When we reached the clearing, the first thing that struck me was how tall the grass actually was. From up on the rocks, it had looked like regular meadow grass, but standing in it, it came up to my shoulders in some places, and I'm 5'10". That meant the big creature we saw had to be at least 8.5, maybe 9 feet tall. We found the area where we thought they'd been. The grass was disturbed, pushed down in places, creating these pathways. There were several logs that had been flipped over, not just pushed, but completely turned. Whatever did this had serious strength. "Jay, look at this," C called from a few feet away. She was pointing at what looked like tracks through the grass. Not distinct footprints, but more like compressed areas where something heavy had stepped. The stride length between these impressions was massive. I tried to match it with my own stride and had to take 3 steps to cover the same distance. Then we found something that made my blood run cold. Near an anthill, there were 2 distinct impressions in the softer dirt. One was huge, a barefoot print with 5 toes, at least 16 inches long. Next to it was a smaller, wider print, also with toes visible, the juvenile. "We should go," I said, taking a quick photo with my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I'm surprised the picture isn't completely blurred. C nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, I don't want to be here if they come back." We practically ran back to the truck. The whole drive back to our campsite, we kept checking the rear-view mirror as if expecting to see that huge figure following us down the road. We packed up our camp in record time and were on the highway before sunset. We had planned to stay another night, but neither of us wanted to be there after dark. During the drive home, we finally talked about what we'd seen. We both agreed they weren't bears, or people in suits, or any animal we recognized. The way the big one moved, its proportions, the lack of a visible neck, the extremely long arms, it all pointed to one thing, but we were both afraid to say it out loud. "It was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" C finally said as we crossed the county line. "2 of them, I corrected her. A parent and a child, I think. The little golden one was acting like a kid, running around playing. And did you notice how it kept coming back to the big one? Almost like it was checking in. I nodded. Maybe it was even nursing. That would explain why it kept returning to the parent's side. It's been 3 weeks now, and I still catch myself looking over my shoulder when I'm outside. I keep wondering if they're still out there, that family unit, living in the remote Montana wilderness. Were they just passing through, or do they live in those mountains permanently? I've researched Sasquatch sightings since we got back, and apparently the Little Belt Mountains have had reports before, though not many. Most people who see something don't report it officially because they're afraid of being ridiculed. I get that now. Before this, I was skeptical about Bigfoot. I figured all the sightings were just bears or people's imaginations. But now, I know what I saw. The image of that massive figure standing up from what I thought was a stump still gives me chills. The golden juvenile bouncing around its parents' legs like an excited kid. The way they moved through that meadow with such purpose. The tracks we found afterward that confirmed we hadn't imagined the whole thing. I don't know if I'll ever go back to the Little Belts. Part of me wants to, just to see if I can spot them again. The other part of me is terrified of what might happen if I did. What if next time they don't just walk away? What if next time they approach us? All I know is that the forests of Montana hold secrets that most people will never see, and maybe that's for the best. Some things change you forever once you've seen them. I haven't been able to look at forests the same way since. Every time I drive past a wooded area now, I scan the tree line, wondering what might be watching from the shadows. I still have the photo of those footprints, but it's not great quality. Even if I shared it, most people would say it's fake or just some animal tracks. But C and I know what we saw. We know what made those tracks. We know what was moving through that meadow on that clear August morning in the Little Belt Mountains, and no one can convince us otherwise. Story 10. I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened, but I need to tell someone who might understand or have experienced something similar. This happened just last month, in August of 1997, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My sister Bethany and I were driving to our mom's place in Mescalero, New Mexico. It's pretty rural out there. Lots of open space, mountains in the distance, and a river that runs nearby. Mom's house is down this gravel road that feels like it goes on forever when it's getting dark. We were picking up my niece and nephew for my son's birthday party the next day. It was around 7 in the evening. The sun was starting to set, and that weird twilight was settling in. You know that time when everything looks a little off? We were chatting about party preparations when I noticed something on the side of the road ahead. At first I thought maybe it was a boulder or possibly someone's garbage that had been dumped, which happens sometimes out there. "What is that?" I asked Bethany, slowing down a bit. She leaned forward in her seat, squinting. "I don't know. Probably just some junk someone left." As we got closer, I flipped on the high beams to get a better look. That's when it happened. The garbage stood up. I'm not exaggerating when I say it unfolded to at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The headlights caught its eyes, which reflected back this deep, unnatural red color. Not like a deer's eyes in headlights. Something completely different and wrong. My stomach dropped instantly. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt the next day. The thing was covered in dark hair, like a thick mat all over its body. But what struck me most was its shape. It had this pointed head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. No neck, none. Just this massive head connected straight to its body. And its arms, God, its arms hung down almost to its knees. Neither of us said a word. I couldn't even breathe. Time seemed to slow down as we locked eyes with this creature. It was only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then it moved, turning away from the lights, and heading toward the river with this fluid, quick stride that didn't seem possible for something so large. I slammed on the gas and swerved onto Mom's driveway so fast that we kicked up a cloud of dust and gravel. Bethany was hyperventilating beside me. "Did you see that? Please tell me you saw that," she kept saying over and over. "I saw it," was all I could manage. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. When we got to the house, we were both white as sheets. Mom took one look at us and knew something was wrong. We tried to explain what we'd seen, but it sounded crazy even as the words came out of my mouth. It wasn't a bear. We've seen plenty of those. It wasn't a person. No way. No human is built like that, moves like that. Mom looked concerned but didn't say much. She just told us to be careful driving home and to keep the kids close. We left earlier than planned before it got completely dark. I drove with one eye on the road and one on the tree line the entire way back to town. But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. A couple weeks later, on August 21st, my husband Robert and I had planned a little camping trip to visit my grandmother in Mescalero. We brought our pop-up camper, thinking it'd be fun to set up by the river behind the brush arbor across from Grandma's house. The spot was beautiful, close enough to the house to visit easily, but private enough to feel like we were really camping. The first night started normal enough. We had dinner with the family, swapped stories, and eventually headed back to our camper to sleep. Robert fell asleep almost immediately, but I've always been a light sleeper, especially when we're not in our own bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when it happened. The whole camper suddenly shook violently, like something had slammed into it. Everything rattled, dishes, the little decorative wind chime I hang inside, everything. Robert shot up in bed. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. "A bear, maybe." But even as I said it, I knew something was off. The impact had come from up high, at roof level, too high for a cow or horse, and even too high for most bears standing on their hind legs. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing else happened that night, but neither of us got much sleep afterward. The next morning, I mentioned it casually to my uncle who lives with Grandma. He looked strange for a moment, then shrugged it off, suggesting maybe it was just the wind or a branch falling. But I could tell something was off about his reaction. On August 23rd, we had a big family dinner outside. There were about 20 of us gathered around, cousins, aunts, uncles, everyone. As the sun set, we lit a bonfire and sat around talking. The kids were playing tag at the edge of the light from the fire when someone, I think it was my cousin Miguel, suddenly went very still. "Do you hear that?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the crackling of the fire and the night insects. Then it came, this strange, unsettling howl that started low and rose in pitch until it sounded disturbingly like a baby crying, but louder. Much louder than any baby could be, and with this unnatural quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. My uncle immediately told all the kids to go inside. No explanations, just inside, now. The older kids protested but were quickly hushed by the looks on the adults' faces. Once they were gone, a heavy silence fell over the group. "Is it back?" my aunt finally asked, looking at my grandmother. "I think so," she replied quietly. "Is what back?" I asked, looking around the circle. "What's going on?" No one wanted to say it. They exchanged glances, looking uncomfortable. Finally, my grandmother sighed. "We didn't want to scare you when you said you were coming to visit. That's why we didn't mention it before." "Mention what?" Robert asked, now looking concerned. "The Sasquatch," my uncle said flatly. "Or Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. It's been around here since last November." I felt a chill run up my spine, remembering what Bethany and I had seen on the road. I described our encounter to them, and several people nodded knowingly. "2 of the grandkids saw it crossing the road last night," my grandmother said. "Same description. Tall, hairy, long arms. the pointed head. The next morning, instead of packing up to leave as we'd planned, we joined my uncles in investigating the area around the property. They showed us what they'd found over the past months. Strange droppings, nothing like the local wildlife, massive tracks near the riverbank, areas of grass that had been matted down as if something huge had been lying there. Behind the chicken coop, we found scattered feathers and signs of something large having pushed through the brush. "Look at this," my uncle said, leading us to the main house. On the dining room window was a huge, dirty handprint, at least twice the size of my husband's hand, and Robert is not a small man. The print was high up, as if whatever left it had been peering in. My 16-year-old cousin finally admitted that 3 weeks earlier she'd been alone in the house doing homework late at night when she felt like she was being watched. She looked up to see a massive, hairy face looking in through the kitchen window, a window that's a good 7 feet off the ground. "It had these eyes," she said, her voice shaking. "They weren't like animal eyes. They looked intelligent." Over lunch, the stories kept coming. Flowers trampled around the property, strange howls and screams in the middle of the night that sent the dogs into a frenzy of barking before they went completely silent, hiding under porches and in closets. Food gone missing from the outside freezer. The feeling of being watched whenever anyone went down to the river alone. My grandmother believed it had started showing up because of the drought. The river behind her property was one of the few reliable water sources that hadn't dried up. The creature was probably drawn to it and then discovered the relatively easy food sources around the houses: chickens, garbage, the occasional unattended barbecue. "Even the mountain lion is gone," my uncle pointed out. "There used to be one that lived up on the ridge across from the house. We'd see it every couple of weeks. Haven't seen it since this thing showed up." We ended up staying an extra night, partly out of concern for the family, and partly, I'll admit, out of morbid curiosity. That night, Robert insisted on setting up our video camera aimed out the camper window toward the tree line where the thing seemed to come from. I was skeptical it would show anything, but agreed. Around midnight, the howling started again, closer this time. It went on for about 20 minutes, moving around the property as if the thing was circling us. I'll never forget lying there, clutching Robert's hand, listening to those sounds. They weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. Something in between and much worse than either. Just as it seemed to be getting closer to our camper, everything went dead silent. The insects stopped chirping. The slight breeze seemed to die completely. Pure, absolute silence, like I've never experienced before. Then came the smell. If you've ever driven past roadkill on a hot day, imagine that, but mixed with something musky and sharp. It seeped into the camper until I had to cover my nose with a pillow. Something large moved past our window, just a shadow but massive. The camper shifted slightly, as if the ground itself was reacting to the weight of whatever was out there. Robert reached for the camera, checking that it was still recording. We heard heavy breathing outside, so close it might as well have been in the camper with us. Then 3 distinct taps on the roof. Gentle, almost deliberate, like someone testing to see what would happen. When nothing did, a much harder impact rattled the entire structure, not violent but firm, purposeful. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Robert was frozen, the camera forgotten in his hand. We heard what sounded like sniffing around the door, and the handle jiggled slightly. Thank God we'd locked it. This went on for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence withdrew. The smell gradually faded. The night insects slowly resumed their chorus. Neither of us slept. At first light, we packed up and left, promising the family we'd come back soon to check on them. When we got home, Robert immediately went to review the footage from the camera. Nothing. The camera had stopped recording about 10 minutes before the encounter started. The battery was still fully charged, but something had caused it to stop. I called my sister Bethany as soon as we got home, and she confirmed she hadn't told anyone about what we'd seen on the road that night. We agreed to drive back the following weekend with better equipment, a higher quality camera, motion sensors, the works. Robert even borrowed a thermal imaging camera from a friend who works in construction. But when we returned to Grandma's house that next weekend, everything was normal. No signs, no sounds, no strange encounters. The family reported that the disturbances had suddenly stopped the day after we left. It was as if the creature knew we were planning to document it and disappeared. I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings in New Mexico since then. There are more reports than you might think, especially around the mountainous regions. Some descriptions match exactly what we saw: the pointed head, the absence of a neck, the unnaturally long arms, the red eyes. What bothers me most isn't just what we experienced, but the fact that something that large and that strange could exist in our modern world without definitive proof. How is that possible? And yet, I know what I saw. I know what I heard and smelled and felt that night by the river. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that baby-like howl in the distance or catch a whiff of that terrible smell. I've started keeping a camera by my bedside, though I'm not sure it would capture anything even if there was something to see. I don't go camping anymore. And whenever I visit my grandmother, I make sure to leave well before dark. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some instincts, once awakened, never quite go back to sleep. I still don't know what it was we encountered in Mescalero that August. I'm not sure I want to know, but I'm certain of one thing: it knew us. It was aware of us in a way that normal animals aren't. And sometimes, when I think back to those red eyes in my headlights, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just watching us. It was reading us, understanding us, and deciding, for reasons I'll never comprehend, to let us go. Story 11. I've been hunting in the mountains of northern New Mexico for over 30 years now, and I've always considered myself pretty level-headed when it comes to the wilderness. I know what's out there, or at least I thought I did, until that September back in '98. It was elk season in Rio Arriba County, and I was out with my buddy Carlos. We'd been hunting partners for about 5 years at that point. He was a good guy, solid in the woods, but not as experienced as me. We'd set up our base camp near the Carson National Forest boundary, planning to spend 4 days tracking elk through those remote canyons and pine forests. The first day had gone well enough. We spotted a few cow elk at a distance, but nothing worth taking, so we were optimistic about day 2. We woke before sunrise, made some quick coffee, grabbed our gear, and headed out while it was still dark. I carried my Remington 708, reliable as hell, and never let me down. Carlos had his binoculars and was handling navigation that morning. It was that perfect September weather in the mountains. Crisp mornings that warmed up nicely by afternoon, aspens just starting to turn gold against all that deep green pine. The kind of day that reminds you why you put up with the early wake-ups and the long hikes. We'd been walking for maybe 2 hours, moving slow and quiet through a mix of pine forest and small meadows. The sun was up now, filtering through the trees. We weren't talking much, just using hand signals mostly, staying downwind as we followed what looked like promising elk sign. That's when it happened. Something changed. I can't really explain it any better than that, but anyone who spends enough time in the woods knows that feeling. It's like the forest shifts around you. The normal background noise, birds, wind in the trees, small animals moving through the brush, it all just changed. I stopped dead in my tracks and Carlos bumped into me from behind. "What's up?" he whispered. I held up my hand for silence. I remember thinking it was strange. I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, but something definitely was. The hair on my arms was standing up. "You feel that?" I asked quietly. Carlos looked confused. "Feel what?" "I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." He looked around nervously. "Like a bear?" "No." I don't know what it is. We stood there for maybe a minute, both of us scanning the trees. I had my rifle ready, not pointed at anything specific, just ready. But I couldn't see anything unusual, and eventually that sense of wrongness seemed to fade a bit. Probably nothing, I said finally. Let's keep moving. Carlos nodded, but I could tell he was on edge now too. We continued on, following a game trail that led up toward a ridge. I figured we'd get up high and glass for elk in the valleys below. We hadn't gone more than 100 yards when it happened. The growl. Jesus Christ, that growl. It's been 25 years, and I can still hear it perfectly in my head. It started low, almost subsonic. You could feel it in your chest before you really heard it. Then it built into something that was both a growl and a roar, but not like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, definitely not an elk. It had this almost human quality to it, but distorted and amplified to something impossible. Like someone had taken a human growl and pumped it through some kind of massive amplifier. It came from the thick stand of pines to our right, and it couldn't have been more than 50 yards away. Carlos literally froze. I mean completely motionless, like he'd turned to stone. I spun toward the sound, bringing my rifle up instinctively. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The growl lasted maybe 5 seconds, and when it stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just us and our breathing and whatever the hell was in those trees. What the fuck was that? Carlos finally whispered. His voice was shaking. Not sure, I lied, trying to sound calmer than I felt. My mind was racing through possibilities, but deep down, I already knew this wasn't something I could explain away. This wasn't something from my 3 decades of hunting experience. "We need to get out of here," Carlos said, his voice rising slightly with panic. "Shh," I cautioned. "It's all right. Probably just a bull elk in rut. They can make some crazy sounds when they're worked up." Even as I said it, I knew it was bullshit. Carlos knew it too, but he nodded desperately, wanting to believe it. Yeah, gotta be," he said. "Still, maybe we should try a different area." I kept my eyes on the tree line where the sound had come from. I couldn't see anything moving, but that feeling was back, that sense of being watched by something intelligent. "Let's move away slowly," I said quietly. "Keep your eyes open. Don't run." I started backing up, and Carlos stuck to me like glue. I have never seen a grown man so scared before or since. He was practically glued to my back as we retreated down the trail. I kept my rifle ready the whole time. We walked for about half an hour without saying much, putting distance between us and whatever made that sound. Carlos wouldn't leave my side for anything. Every snapping twig made him jump, and if I'm being honest, I was pretty rattled myself. By midday, we'd moved to a completely different area, a few miles from where we'd heard the growl. Carlos had calmed down somewhat, but he still wouldn't let me get more than 10 feet away from him. "You're the only one with a gun," he kept saying. "I'm staying with you." I didn't argue. Truth is, I was glad for the company too. We didn't see any elk that day. Not surprising, we were both too distracted to hunt effectively. By late afternoon, I suggested we head back to camp. Carlos practically sprinted ahead of me once our tent was in sight. That night, around the campfire, I didn't bring up what we'd heard. Carlos seemed content to pretend it never happened, and I didn't want to make him more uncomfortable than he already was. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That growl, it wasn't natural. It had power behind it, real power, and a kind of intelligence in the way it modulated. Like it was meant to scare us off, a warning. The weird stuff didn't stop there. The next morning we were making breakfast when a dog wandered into our camp. Some kind of hunting hound, looked like a plot hound but bigger. No owner in sight. The dog was skinny and had this wild look in its eyes, like it had seen something that terrified it to its core. "Hey boy," I called, trying to check if it had a collar. That dog wouldn't let either of us anywhere near it. It hovered at the edge of our camp, clearly hungry, but too afraid to let humans touch it. We left some food out, which it devoured before disappearing back into the woods. It came back a few more times that day, always keeping its distance, always looking over its shoulder like it was being pursued. I've had hunting dogs all my life. I know what a dog looks like when it's been running deer or bear. This was different. This dog was traumatized by something. Later that day, while Carlos stayed near camp, he'd lost his enthusiasm for hunting after the incident, I scouted the area a bit. That's when I noticed the tree formations. At the time, I thought they were elk rubs, but they didn't look quite right. Elk rub their antlers on smaller trees, stripping bark to mark territory and strengthen their necks for fighting. These were different. Entire small trees, twisted and broken about 7 feet off the ground, not snapped like from wind damage, but deliberately twisted, almost like someone had grabbed them and wrung them like a wet towel. I remember taking photos of them with my old film camera, thinking they were unusual. It wasn't until years later, after I'd done some reading, that I realized what I'd been looking at, what some people call Bigfoot twists or territory markers. We cut our trip short that year. Carlos came up with some excuse about stomach problems, but I knew the real reason. Neither of us felt comfortable out there anymore. Something was watching us, something that didn't want us in its territory. Fast forward to the fall of 2000. I was out hunting again, this time for deer, with mostly the same group of friends, but in a different area, further south. One night around the campfire, after a few beers, the conversation turned to strange experiences in the woods. Someone brought up a story they'd heard about mountain lions. And I don't know what came over me, but I said, "You want to hear something weird? I think I ran into Bigfoot a couple years ago." There was the expected laughter, of course. Bigfoot jokes, Sasquatch impressions, the usual stuff. But once that died down, I told them about the growl, about how it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. I described that feeling of being watched, the dog that showed up terrified, the twisted trees. The laughter stopped pretty quickly. The 4 other guys looked at each other uncomfortably, and then Mike, who'd arrived the day before I did on this trip, cleared his throat. "Funny you should mention that," he said. "The night before you got here, we were sitting right here, and we heard something up in those hills." He pointed to the ridge west of our camp. Wasn't just one sound. It was like a series of screams or moans. Went on for maybe 15 minutes. "Yeah," Tony added. "Freaked us out so bad, we all grabbed our rifles and stayed up half the night. Didn't sound like a person, didn't sound like an animal either." I felt my skin prickle. "Why didn't you tell me this when I got here?" Mike shrugged. "Same reason you didn't mention your story until now, probably. Didn't want to sound crazy." We talked about it for hours that night. It turned out 3 of the 5 guys had had unexplainable experiences in the woods over the years. Things they'd seen or heard that didn't fit with known wildlife. Shadows moving upright through trees, finding their camps disturbed, but nothing stolen. Strange footprints. Most people don't associate New Mexico with Bigfoot. They think Pacific Northwest, not Desert Southwest. But northern New Mexico has some of the most remote wilderness in the country, and it supports one of the largest elk herds in the nation. If something like Bigfoot exists, following elk herds would make sense. Consistent food source, moving through remote terrain. The place where Carlos and I heard that growl wasn't far from the Colorado border. The Continental Divide runs right through there, creating this perfect corridor of wilderness stretching from Canada all the way down. And I've since learned there have been other sightings further south in the state, around Ruidoso, which also happens to have large elk herds. Look, I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot. I never actually saw anything that day. But what I heard, that growl, it wasn't from any animal I know. And I know most of the animals in these mountains. It had weight to it, meaning. It was a warning from something intelligent enough to want us gone, but not wanting direct confrontation. Sometimes I think about going back to that exact spot. I've got better equipment now, trail cameras and such, But then I remember the feeling that came over me when I heard that sound, that primal fear response that bypasses all rational thought. Some part of my brain recognized a predator higher up the food chain than me, and all the rifles and technology in the world don't quite wash away that feeling. I still hunt those mountains every year. I still love being out in the wilderness, but I'm more careful now about where I go and how long I stay. I pay attention when the forest goes quiet, when that feeling of being watched creeps up my spine. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my tent at night and the wind dies down, I swear I can hear something moving through the trees just beyond the firelight. Something that walks almost like a man, but not quite. Something that knows these mountains far better than I ever will. Whatever it was that made that sound, it changed me. Not in any dramatic way that others would notice, but deep down, it shook something loose, that absolute certainty about what is and isn't possible out there in the wild places that still exist in this world. Story 12. I've debated sharing this for years now. Most people would probably laugh it off or think I'm making it up for attention, but I swear on everything I hold dear, what happened to me back in November of 1998 was real. I'm still trying to make sense of it more than 20 years later. I'm an avid hunter, have been since I was a kid. I live in New Mexico and had been planning an elk hunting trip with my brother Mike and our cousin Tony to Rio Arriba County for months. We'd been mapping the area, tracking migration patterns and getting our gear ready since summer. But about a week before we were set to head out, I screwed up my back something fierce while loading supplies into my truck. I was lifting a cooler, something I'd done 1,000 times, when I felt this sharp pain shoot down my spine, like someone had jammed a hot knife into my lower back. I dropped to my knees, right there in my driveway. My wife wanted me to cancel the trip, but I'd been looking forward to it all year. No way was I backing out. The drive up to Rio Arriba County was pure torture. 3 hours of shifting in my seat, trying to find a position that didn't make me want to scream. I was popping ibuprofen like candy, but it barely touched the pain. Mike kept asking if I wanted to turn around, but I was stubborn. "I'll be fine once we get there and I can stretch out," I kept telling him. We set up camp that evening, and I barely slept. The thin sleeping pad might as well have been concrete. By morning, I could barely stand straight. Mike took one look at me and said, "Dude, you're in no shape to be hiking all over these mountains." He was right, but I hadn't come all this way to sit at camp. We compromised. We'd take the ATVs as far as we could up the mountain, and I'd find a good spot to take a stand while they did the real hiking. The temperature that morning was brutal, probably in the high 20s. We bundled up and rode the ATVs for about 45 minutes before reaching our planned hunting area. The vibration from the ATV didn't do my back any favors. Every bump sent shockwaves of pain up my spine. "I'll radio if I see anything," I told Mike as we separated. "Don't do anything stupid," he warned, giving me a look that said he knew I probably would anyway. I found a decent spot against a large pine tree about 20 minutes later. The ground was hard and cold, and my back was screaming. I tried to focus on scanning the area for elk, but the pain kept distracting me. The cold wasn't helping either. It seemed to seep into my bones and make the pain worse. After about an hour of sitting there, shivering and miserable, I decided I needed to move. The sun had risen higher, and I could see a small clearing about 50 yards away where sunlight was streaming through the trees. I figured maybe if I could warm up a bit, my back would loosen. I couldn't walk properly, so I ended up doing this pathetic crawl shuffle thing, dragging my rifle alongside me. It took forever to reach that small patch of sunlight, and I was sweating despite the cold by the time I got there. I leaned back against another tree, facing the sun, and closed my eyes for a moment. The warmth felt amazing on my face. For a few minutes, I just sat there trying to breathe through the pain. That's when I first heard it, a sound like squirrels running up and down the pine trees around me. I didn't think much of it initially. These woods were full of wildlife. But then I noticed the sound was moving from tree to tree, circling around where I sat. I opened my eyes and scanned the area. The forest was dense with pines and aspens. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, pine needles, and rocks. Nothing seemed out of place, but that squirrel sound continued, moving around me. Then something hit a tree trunk about 10 feet to my left with a loud thwack. I jerked my head toward the sound and saw a rock about the size of a golf ball rolling on the ground. Before I could process what was happening, another rock hit a different tree to my right. My first thought was that maybe some kids were messing around in the woods, but we were miles from any trails or campgrounds. Plus, we hadn't seen another vehicle all morning. Another rock flew through the air. This time, I actually saw it mid-flight. It slammed into a tree trunk with enough force to knock off a chunk of bark. Whatever was throwing these rocks was strong, really strong. That's when it hit me, the rock throwing. I'd heard stories since I was a kid about Sasquatch or Bigfoot throwing rocks to scare people away from their territory. Most of the old-timers around here had some version of that story. I'd always laughed it off as campfire tales meant to scare tourists. I wasn't laughing now. My heart started hammering in my chest. I reached for my rifle, more for comfort than any real thought of using it. What would I even be shooting at? I hadn't seen anything except flying rocks. Another rock hit a tree, this one even harder. Then another. They were coming at intervals of less than a minute apart. I tried to track where they were coming from, but they seemed to be originating from different directions, always from the dense tree line surrounding the clearing. I wanted to stand up and get out of there, but my back had locked up completely. The pain and fear had me paralyzed. I was a sitting duck. The rocks continued to fly. One landed just a few feet from me, kicking up dirt and pine needles. It wasn't a small rock either. This one was the size of my fist. If it had hit me directly, it would have done serious damage. What struck me as the strangest thing was the silence. Other than the impact of the rocks, there was no sound. No footsteps crunching on the forest floor, no breaking branches, no breathing or calls, nothing. Just the rocks hitting trees and the ground, and my own panicked breathing and heartbeat pounding in my ears. I strained to see something, anything, moving in the forest. The tree line was about 30 yards away in all directions. The pines were thick, creating deep shadows between them. Perfect hiding places. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The rocks kept coming, sometimes hitting trees so hard that I could see splinters of bark explode from the impact. Whatever was throwing them had to be incredibly strong. I fumbled for the two-way radio in my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I pressed the talk button. "Mike," I whispered urgently. "Mike, you there?" After a few seconds of static, his voice came through. "Yeah, what's up? You see something?" "I need help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something's throwing rocks at me. Big rocks, hard." There was a moment of silence before he replied, sounding confused. "What do you mean something's throwing rocks?" "I mean exactly what I said," I hissed, as another rock slammed into a tree nearby. "I can't move because of my back, and something's been throwing rocks at me for over an hour now. I need you to come get me." "Where are you?" he asked, his tone changing from confused to concerned. I described my location as best I could, mentioning the clearing and some distinctive trees nearby. "Hurry," I added as I ended the transmission. The rocks kept coming while I waited for Mike. One hit so close to my foot that I jerked back, sending a spasm of pain through my back that made me gasp. I sat there, clutching my rifle, scanning the tree line for any movement. It took Mike about 20 minutes to find me. When he burst into the clearing, rifle at the ready, I've never been so relieved to see another human being in my life. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, crouching beside me. As if in answer, a rock shot out from the trees and hit an aspen about 15 feet away from us with a loud crack. Mike's eyes widened. "What the? Been happening for over an hour," I said through gritted teeth. "They're coming from all around." He stood up, rifle raised, scanning the forest. "Hello?" he called out. "Who's there?" Nothing but silence greeted his question. Then another rock flew out from a different direction, hitting a tree hard enough to leave a dent in the trunk. "Jesus," Mike muttered, "those are being thrown with some serious force." We watched as more rocks came flying out of the forest for the next half hour. Mike tried to track where they were coming from, but it was impossible. They seemed to be exiting the trees, about 8 feet off the ground, which meant whatever was throwing them had to be tall or up in the trees. "This isn't normal," Mike said quietly. "No person could throw rocks this hard, this consistently, for this long." Eventually, the rock throwing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. We waited in tense silence for about 15 minutes, but no more rocks came. "Think it's gone?" I asked. Mike shook his head. "No idea, but we need to get you out of here regardless." He helped me to my feet, supporting most of my weight as pain shot through my back. Before heading back to the ATVs, Mike wanted to check the area where most of the rocks had come from. I wasn't keen on the idea, but he insisted. We moved slowly to the tree line, me hobbling and leaning on him. The ground there was mostly rock and hard-packed dirt, not ideal for leaving footprints. We searched for about 10 minutes but found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches at eye level, nothing to indicate what had been there. The ride back to camp was quiet. Both of us were trying to process what had happened. Tony was already there when we arrived, having had no luck spotting elk. When we told him what happened, he looked skeptical at first, but Mike was dead serious. "I saw it too," he insisted. "Something was throwing those rocks with incredible force. No human could have done that, not over and over like that." That night around the campfire, Tony mentioned that his grandfather used to tell stories about the big people in the mountains who would throw rocks to warn people away from their territory. "They move without making sound," he said, "like ghosts in the forest." I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound outside the tent had me on edge. My back was in agony, but it wasn't just the physical pain keeping me awake. It was the realization that something had been out there watching me, something strong enough to throw rocks with devastating force, something that could move through the forest without making a sound. We packed up and left the next morning. I told the guys I couldn't handle another day with my back in that condition, but truthfully, I just wanted to get the hell out of those mountains. I've been on dozens of hunting trips since then, but I've never gone back to that particular area of Rio Arriba County. My back eventually healed, but I still get a chill down my spine whenever I hear stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I used to laugh at those stories. I don't anymore, because here's what I know for certain. Something was in those woods that day. Something intelligent enough to try to scare me away rather than attack directly. Something strong enough to throw rocks with incredible force. Something that could move through a forest without making a sound. Science says Bigfoot doesn't exist, but science hasn't explained what happened to me that cold November day in 1998. And until it does, I'll keep wondering what was watching me from those trees and why it let me leave. Story 13. I've been putting off writing about this for decades now. It's been 36 years, but I can still feel my heart racing when I think about that morning in November of '87. I was 23 back then, living with my dad in Otero County, New Mexico, just outside the Mescalero Reservation. We weren't far from the Inn of the Mountain Gods Resort, where I worked as a housekeeper. My cousin Raphael had just moved to the area and got hired in maintenance at the same place. That morning started like any other. It was cold, the kind of mountain cold that seeps into your bones. We'd had a light dusting of snow the night before, just enough to make everything look different. Dad's truck was in the shop, and Raphael's car wouldn't start, battery dead from the cold snap we'd been having. We called around, but nobody we knew was heading toward the resort that early. Our shift started at 6, and we couldn't afford to miss work. Raphael had only been there 3 weeks, and I was saving for community college classes. "We should start walking," Raphael suggested. "Maybe catch a ride on the main highway." I didn't like the idea much. It was still dark out, probably around 4:30 in the morning, and the walk to the highway was at least 2 miles through fairly isolated country. But we didn't have much choice. We bundled up, me in my navy blue coat that was a little too thin for November mornings in the mountains, and Raphael in his work jacket with the extra flannel underneath. I remember being irritated about the whole situation. Dad had been promising to get me a used car for months, but something always came up. Another repair on the house, helping my uncle with medical bills. There was always something. The sky was just starting to lighten as we headed down the dirt road that connected our place to the county road. There was no streetlight, just the beam of Raphael's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The mountains were these massive black shapes against a slightly less black sky. You could smell the pine and the cold. We'd been walking maybe 15 minutes when I first heard it, a rustling sound from across the road in the tree line that borders the national forest. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably a deer or elk, common enough in those parts. "Did you hear that?" Raphael asked, stopping suddenly. I nodded, not wanting to speak. Something about the sound made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. We kept walking, picking up our pace a little. The sound came again, but this time it was clearly moving parallel to us. That's when I remembered what had happened 3 days earlier. I'd been hanging laundry out back, just as dusk was falling. Dad didn't believe in electric dryers. Waste of money, he'd say. I was pinning up the last of his work shirts when I heard it, a high-pitched scream that seemed to come from the forest behind our property. It wasn't quite a woman's scream, not quite an animal sound either. It made my skin crawl. When I told Dad about it later that night, he'd waved it off. "Just an elk," he'd said, not looking up from his newspaper. But there was something in the way he said it that didn't ring true. I'd lived around elk my whole life. That wasn't an elk. Now, walking in the pre-dawn darkness with something moving in the trees alongside us, that memory hit me hard. "Let's move faster," I whispered to Raphael. He nodded and we quickened our pace. The thing in the trees matched our speed. When we stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. When we started walking again, so did it. The road had a shallow ditch on either side, then about 20 feet of open space before the tree line. Whatever was paralleling us was staying just inside the trees where we couldn't see it clearly. "What is that?" Raphael whispered, his voice tight with tension. "I don't know," I said, though a suspicion was forming in my mind. Growing up on the edge of the reservation, I'd heard stories. Most people didn't talk openly about them, at least not with outsiders, but they were there, whispered around campfires or in kitchens late at night when the kids were supposedly asleep. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. The locals had other names for it too. As kids, my cousins and I used to scare each other with those stories. As adults, we pretended we didn't believe them anymore, but my dad had always been strict about us kids coming inside before dark. He blamed it on bears, but we didn't have many problem bears in our immediate area. It was something else he was worried about. A branch snapped loudly in the trees, and Raphael grabbed my arm. This wasn't a small animal. The sound was like someone breaking a thick piece of wood. Whatever was in there was big. "Maybe we should go back," Raphael suggested, his voice barely audible. I considered it. We were about halfway to the county road now. Going back meant walking the same distance, still with this thing following us. Going forward meant at least the possibility of hitting the county road where a car might pass. "Let's keep going," I said, "but faster." We started walking again, nearly jogging now. The crunching of our boots on the gravel road seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. The sky was gradually lightening, but the forest was still lost in shadow. The thing in the trees kept pace with us. It wasn't even trying to be quiet now. Branches snapped, undergrowth rustled. At one point, I swear I heard heavy breathing, not like a person, more like something massive drawing air into enormous lungs. Then it let out a sound that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't the high-pitched scream I'd heard days before. This was lower, a kind of rumbling growl that rose into something almost like speech, but not quite. It reminded me of how a dog sounds when it's trying to mimic human talking, that deliberate modulation of sound, but without forming actual words. Raphael and I froze. The sound echoed slightly in the crisp air. Then it came again, louder this time, closer. Without discussing it, we both broke into a run. My lungs burned with the cold air. Raphael was ahead of me, his longer legs carrying him faster. I could hear the thing keeping pace, crashing through the underbrush now. It was definitely running too. "Maria!" Raphael shouted, turning back for me. "Come on!" I was running as fast as I could, but my work shoes weren't made for this. One foot slipped on a patch of ice, and I went down hard, skinning my palm on the gravel. The pain was sharp, but distant. All I could focus on was the crashing sound getting closer. Raphael was at my side in an instant, hauling me to my feet. "It's coming out of the trees," he hissed, and my heart nearly stopped. I looked back and saw movement at the edge of the forest. Something was emerging from between two pine trees. In the dim pre-dawn light, I couldn't make out details, just a massive dark shape, taller than a man, much taller, broad shoulders, and it was moving with purpose, directly toward us. Raphael pulled me forward and we ran like I've never run in my life. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I could taste blood in the back of my throat from the cold air. Behind us, I heard heavy footfalls on the gravel road. It was out of the trees now, following us openly. I didn't dare look back again. Part of me didn't want to see it clearly, as if not seeing it fully would somehow make it less real. We had maybe half a mile to go before the county road. There were no houses along this stretch, nowhere to seek shelter. Just the road, the ditch, and the forest pressing in on both sides. The footfalls behind us were getting closer. Whatever it was, it moved fast for something so large. Each impact on the gravel sent a jolt of terror through me. Thud, 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 getting nearer. Then I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the rumble of an engine. Coming up the road behind us was a pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the grey morning. Raphael and I stopped in the middle of the road and started waving frantically. I risked a glance behind us. The shape was gone, either back in the trees or hidden in the ditch. The truck slowed as it approached, an old Ford with a rusted green body. The window rolled down, revealing an older man with a weathered face I didn't recognize. "You two need a ride?" he asked, eyeing us suspiciously. We didn't wait for a second invitation. Raphael yanked open the passenger door, and I scrambled in first, sliding to the middle of the bench seat. Raphael jumped in after me and slammed the door. "Thanks," he panted. "Our car broke down back there." It was a lie, but easier than explaining the truth. The man nodded, putting the truck back in gear. As we pulled away, I couldn't help looking out the back window. For a second, I thought I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the headlight's reach, something moved. Just for an instant, I caught a glimpse of a massive, hair-covered figure standing in the ditch beside the road. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with broad shoulders and long arms. Then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. The man driving the truck must have noticed my expression in the rearview mirror. "You folks okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Raphael glanced at me, and I could read the warning in his eyes. People around here didn't talk about these things, not to strangers. "Just cold," I said. "Thanks again for stopping." The man nodded, seemingly satisfied with that explanation. "Heading to the resort?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Raphael answered. "We work there. I'm going right past it. Construction job up at the ski area." We rode in silence for a while. My heart was still pounding and my hands were shaking. I shoved them between my knees to hide the trembling. "You two from around here?" the man asked eventually. "Yes, just down that road we were on," I said. "Santiago Place." Something flickered across his face when I said our name. Santiago, he repeated. You Carlos's girl. That's my dad, I confirmed. He nodded slowly. Thought you looked familiar. I did some roofing work for your dad maybe 5 years back. He paused, then added, beautiful country out there. Bet it gets pretty wild at night, though. There was something in the way he said it, a question that wasn't really a question. It does, I said carefully. Dad doesn't like us to be out after dark. Says there are bears. The man made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Bears. Sure. He glanced at me sidelong. Your dad ever tell you about the time he and I were working on that roof and heard something in the woods? Never seen a man move so fast to pack up his tools before sundown. I shook my head. Dad never talked about things like that. Well, the man continued, whatever it wasn't no bear. Bears don't stand 9 feet tall and watch you from the tree line. Raphael and I exchanged glances. The man caught it and smiled grimly. Yeah, I figured you two might have just had a similar experience. People around here don't like to talk about it much. Bad luck, some say. Others just don't want to sound crazy. He shrugged. Me, I've been up in these mountains for 67 years, seen things I can't explain. That's just how it is out here. We were approaching the turnoff for the resort now. The sun was finally up, painting the snow-dusted mountains pink and gold. In the daylight, what had happened seemed almost dreamlike, though my scraped palm and racing heart told me otherwise. The man pulled up to the employee entrance of the resort. You two be careful, he said as we got out, especially at dawn and dusk. That's when they move around most. They? Raphael couldn't help asking. The man just smiled and put the truck in gear. Thanks for the company, he said, and drove off. Raphael and I stood there for a moment, watching the truck disappear around a bend in the road. We're not telling anyone about this, Raphael said finally. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Who would believe us anyway? We were both quiet for the rest of the day, going through our work mechanically. During my lunch break, I went to the resort's small library where they kept books about local history and wildlife for the guests. I found what I was looking for in a slim volume titled Folklore of the Southwest. There was just a short paragraph mentioning that the Apache had legends of tall, hairy men who lived deep in the forests of the mountains. They were rarely seen, but their screams could sometimes be heard echoing through the canyons at night. When Dad picked us up that evening, his truck now fixed, he noticed something was off. You two are quiet, he remarked as we drove home. Raphael and I exchanged glances. Just tired, I said. Dad nodded, but he kept glancing at me. As we pulled up to the house, he turned off the engine, but didn't immediately get out. Something happened today? He asked directly. I hesitated. Dad had always shut down any talk of strange things in the woods, but the truck driver's story made me wonder if he knew more than he let on. We had to walk part of the way this morning, I said carefully, before we got a ride. Dad's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Where? From the house to about halfway to the county road. His jaw clenched. You hear anything? The directness of the question surprised me. I glanced at Raphael, who gave a small nod. Yes, I admitted. Something was following us in the trees. Dad was quiet for a long moment. You see it? Just a shape. It was big. He nodded slowly, staring out at the darkening forest behind our house. Your grandmother, my mother, she saw one once. Up close, she was hanging laundry, kind of like you were the other day. He paused. She said it watched her for a while, then just walked back into the trees. What are they? Raphael asked quietly. Dad shrugged. The old people have names for them, stories. Me, I don't need to name something to know it's best left alone. He opened his door. Don't walk to work in the dark anymore. You wait for a ride, you hear me? Even if it makes you late. That was all he ever said about it. We never discussed it again, not with him, not with each other, but for years afterward, whenever I stayed at Dad's house, I'd sometimes catch him standing on the back porch at dusk, staring out at the tree line, like he was watching for something. I've moved away since then, down to Las Cruces, where the desert stretches for miles, and you can see anything coming from a long way off. I tell myself that's not why I chose to live here, but some nights when the wind blows a certain way, I remember that rumbling growl that was almost speech. I wonder what it would have done if that truck hadn't come along. Raphael still lives up there, though not on that same road. He says nothing's happened since, but he doesn't let his kids play outside after the sun starts to set. He blames it on bears. Some things just run in the family, I guess. Story 14. Udain. I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes, thinking about what happened that day in October 2018. Some of you might have heard the rumors about what lives along the San Juan River. Most folks think it's just old desert stories to scare kids, but I know better. I've lived on this same patch of land since 1994, and I've seen things that no one should ever have to see. My name's Thomas, and my property sits about 1/8 of a mile from the river in San Juan County. It's usually peaceful out here, just me, my 2 dogs, and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. The land is mostly scrubby desert with the Russian olive trees growing thick along the riverbank. It's the kind of place where you can go days without seeing another soul if you want to. The first time I heard about the creature was back in '96 from my neighbor Earl, who'd been fishing down by the river. He came to my place white as a sheet, talking about some huge hairy thing he'd seen moving through the trees. I laughed it off, figured he'd been hitting the bottle too hard. But then I started hearing more stories. The Navajo ranch hand who quit his job after seeing something watching him from the tree line. The family who moved away after finding massive, unidentifiable footprints on their property. After a while, it got harder to dismiss. The thing about living out here is you get to know the patterns. I've noticed over the years that whatever this thing is, it comes through every 3 to 5 years. Usually in the fall. You can tell when it's in the area because all the dogs in the county start going crazy. My own dogs, Rex and Scout, they're usually pretty calm, but when that thing is around, they won't stop howling and whining. Anyway, that day started like any other. I woke up early, had my coffee on the porch, and planned to fix some fencing on the south side of my property. It was a clear morning, cool, but not cold yet, typical for October around here. The first weird thing I noticed was that Rex and Scout were acting strange. They kept pacing around the yard, sniffing the air and whimpering. I figured maybe there was a coyote nearby or something. By around 10 in the morning, I was out working on the fence when I noticed the birds had gone quiet. If you've spent any time in the desert, you know that's not normal. There's always some kind of bird chatter, but suddenly nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole landscape. I remember thinking that maybe we were in for a storm, even though the sky was clear. That's when I got that feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you know something's watching you. I turned around slow, scanning the property, but didn't see anything out of place. I tried to shake it off and went back to work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The dogs had followed me out to the fence line, and they were sticking close to my legs, which wasn't like them at all. Usually, they'd be running around, chasing rabbits or lizards. Around noon, I headed back to the house for lunch. The whole time I don't know how to describe it except to say it felt like there were eyes on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was never anything there, just the empty desert and the line of olive trees in the distance marking the river. After lunch, I decided to check my shed. I needed some tools I hadn't used in a while, and honestly, I guess I was looking for a distraction. The shed's about 50 yards from my house, a simple metal structure where I keep all my equipment. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Now, I'm always careful about locking things up. You have to be out here where the nearest neighbor is a mile away. and I was positive I'd closed it the last time I used it. I approached slowly, figuring maybe the wind had blown it open, though it would have had to be one hell of a gust. When I was about 20 feet away, I heard something moving inside. My first thought was maybe a coyote or a stray dog had found its way in, so I called out, thinking I'd scare whatever it was. "Hey, get out of there!" The noises stopped immediately. I stood there for a moment, listening. Then there was a shuffling sound, something heavy moving across the concrete floor. I'll be honest, I nearly turned and ran right then. But this was my property, my shed, and I wasn't about to let some animal tear up my stuff. So I grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the side of the shed and pushed the door open wider. The smell hit me first. If you've ever smelled a dead animal that's been sitting in the sun for days, it was like that but worse. Like rotting meat mixed with something musky and sour. It was so strong it made my eyes water. And then I saw it. Standing in the back corner of my shed was something I still struggle to describe. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, because it was slightly hunched over to fit under the roof. It was covered in thick, brownish-red hair or fur, not like a bear's, more matted and uneven. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, probably twice the width of mine, and I'm not a small guy. But its face, Jesus, its face is what gives me nightmares. It wasn't fully human, but it wasn't fully animal either. The eyes were deep-set and dark, almost hidden under a heavy brow ridge. Its nose was flat and wide, and below that was a mouth that seemed too large for its face, with yellowed teeth visible even in the dim light of the shed. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, literally couldn't make my legs work. It was like my brain had short-circuited from pure terror. The creature was breathing heavily, its massive chest rising and falling. Each exhale brought another wave of that horrible stench. Then it made a noise. Not a growl or a roar like you'd expect from an animal, but a low rumbling sound that seemed to start deep in its chest and vibrate the air around us. It was almost like speech, but not any language I've ever heard. That sound, I swear it did something to me physically. I felt it in my bones and my ears started ringing. Something inside me snapped then, and I finally managed to move. I stumbled backward, dropping the shovel. The creature flinched at the clatter of metal on concrete, and for a second I thought it was going to charge at me. But instead, it shifted its weight from one foot to the other, like it was uncertain. That's when I noticed it was holding something, one of my older chainsaws that I'd been meaning to repair. It was turning the chainsaw over in its hands, examining it almost curiously. Its hands were huge, with long fingers that looked surprisingly dexterous despite their size. I took another step back, and this time the creature made a different sound, a sharp, barking noise that made me freeze again. It set the chainsaw down surprisingly gently on my workbench, never taking its eyes off me. Then the dogs started barking. They'd followed me to the shed, but had been strangely quiet until now. Their sudden noise seemed to agitate the creature. It straightened up as much as it could in the confines of the shed and made that rumbling noise again, louder this time. I should have run. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed, watching as this impossible thing took a step toward me. The shed suddenly felt tiny, like the walls were closing in. The creature was close enough now that I could see details I wish I could forget. The way its hair parted to reveal patches of skin that looked almost human, but wasn't quite right. The strange, knuckled structure of its face. The way its hands curled and uncurled at its sides. And then, thank God, a car door slammed somewhere in the distance. Probably my neighbor up the road, but it was enough to break the spell. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and it made a different noise, a higher-pitched, almost anxious sound. I seized the opportunity and bolted out of the shed, not looking back. I sprinted toward the house, my legs feeling like jelly. I could hear the dogs still barking, but they were following me now. When I reached the porch, I finally turned around, half expecting to see that thing bearing down on me. but the shed door was still open and there was no sign of movement. I grabbed the shotgun I keep by the door. I know, I should have had it with me in the first place, but who expects to find a 7-foot monster in their shed? And stood there on the porch trying to catch my breath. For what felt like hours, I waited, watching the shed. The dogs had positioned themselves at the bottom of the porch steps, hackles raised, focused on the shed. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across my property. Still, there was no movement from the shed. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I checked that the shotgun was loaded and started slowly making my way back, keeping as much distance as possible. When I was about 30 yards away, I saw something move, not in the shed, but in the scrub brush beyond it, heading toward the river. It was big, moving on 2 legs, but in a strange, loping gait that covered ground with frightening speed. I raised the shotgun, but it was already too far away, and honestly, I don't know if I could have pulled the trigger. Whatever that thing was, it seemed, I don't know, intelligent somehow. The way it had handled the chainsaw, the way it had looked at me, there was something going on behind those eyes. I approached the shed cautiously, shotgun ready. The stench was still there, though not as overpowering as before. Inside, everything looked normal except for a few items moved around on my workbench. The chainsaw was exactly where the creature had placed it. And on the concrete floor, clearly visible in the dust, were footprints, massive, human-like footprints, easily 16 inches long, with what looked like 5 toes. But the shape wasn't quite right, broader across the ball of the foot, narrower at the heel. I closed and locked the shed, then went back to the house and called Bill, the county sheriff. Bill and I go way back. We were in high school together, and he's one of the few people around here who doesn't laugh when folks talk about the creature. He's seen it himself, about 6 years earlier, while fishing upstream near the Colorado border. He came out within the hour, and I showed him the shed and the footprints. He took some pictures, measured them, and wrote everything down in his notebook. But we both knew he wouldn't be filing an official report. Who would believe it? "It's been following the river down from Colorado," he said as we stood looking toward the line of trees. "Ramirez over in Bloomfield saw something similar last week. Said it was going through his trash bins at night." "What the hell is it, Bill?" I asked. He just shook his head. "Don't know. Don't want to know. But it's been coming through every few years as long as I can remember. My daddy used to talk about it too." Bill stayed for a while, helped me secure the property. We checked that all the windows and doors were locked, and he even helped me set up some motion sensor lights around the place. Before he left, he gave me a serious look. "Thomas, whatever you do, don't go chasing after it, especially not down by the river. That's where it seems most at home, in those olive trees, and for Christ's sake, don't go out at night until we're sure it's moved on." I didn't need to be told twice. After he left, I brought the dogs inside, made sure my shotgun was loaded, and sat in my living room with all the lights on. I don't think I slept at all that night. Every little noise had me jumping, and the dogs were restless, pacing and whining. The next morning, I found massive tracks leading from the shed toward the river, confirming what I'd seen. Over the next few days, there were more sightings reported up and down the river. A fly fisherman saw it drinking from the water at dawn. A woman out walking her dog ran into her house after seeing something huge moving through the trees, and the dogs in the county kept howling, especially at night. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the sighting stopped. The dogs calmed down, and life went back to normal. It was like the creature had just continued on its way, following whatever mysterious path it travels every few years. I've thought a lot about what I saw that day, tried to rationalize it, explain it away, but I know what I saw, and I know that in another 3 to 5 years, when the dogs start howling again and that uneasy feeling settles over the county, it'll be back. Following the river, moving through the Russian olive forests, stopping to examine the strange things humans leave in its path. I've reinforced my shed since then, installed better locks and more lights. But sometimes at night, when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that awful smell. And in those moments, I find myself wondering, is it curious about us the same way we're curious about it? Does it tell stories about its encounters with strange, hairless creatures that build shelters and make loud machines? Or does it simply see us as intruders in its territory, something to be avoided as it makes its mysterious journey along the San Juan River? I don't know, but I do know that come next fall, I'll be keeping my shed locked tight and my shotgun close at hand. Because some things you only need to see once to know they're real, and some encounters you pray never happen again. Story 15. I was 30 years old back then, studying machine drafting at a trade school in Albuquerque. My life was pretty normal. Coursework, part-time job at an auto shop, weekend beers with classmates. Nothing special. Nothing that would prepare me for what happened in those woods. Our school organized this camping trip in Santa Fe National Forest as an end-of-year thing. It was supposed to be a chance to blow off steam before finals, but without alcohol since it was school-sponsored. About 20 of us went, mostly guys from my program, a few from electrical engineering, and a couple instructors to keep things in line. We set up camp about 7 miles outside of Cuba in Rio Arriba County. Beautiful spot. Tall pines everywhere, clean mountain air, views that made you feel small in the best way possible. Our first day there was perfect. Hiked a few trails, had a massive cookout, stayed up telling stupid jokes around the campfire. Normal stuff. Some guys wanted to sneak beers, but the instructors were watching pretty close. I didn't care much either way. I had my own tent, this old Coleman 2-person I'd bought at a garage sale the summer before. Nothing fancy, but it kept the bugs out. I set it up a little bit away from the others because some of the guys snored like chainsaws. Maybe 50 yards from the main group, on this small flat area near some scrub oak. Close enough to still be part of things, but far enough that I could actually sleep. That night, I turned in around 11. Was pretty tired from hiking all day. I remember zipping up my sleeping bag and just listening to the forest for a while. Wind in the pine needles, some distant owl, the occasional laugh from the guys who were still up. Peaceful. I dozed off thinking about final projects and whether I'd have enough money for a new drafting table after graduation. I woke up suddenly at what my watch said was 4 in the morning. Not gradually, not the way you normally wake up. It was like someone flipped a switch in my brain from asleep to completely alert. And the first thing that hit me was the smell. God, that smell. It wasn't just bad, it was wrong. Like something had died, but not just died. Like it had rotted and then somehow mixed with ammonia and sulfur and this musky animal scent I'd never encountered before. It was so powerful it actually burned inside my nose and throat. My eyes watered instantly. My first thought was that something was on fire, but it wasn't smoke. This was organic, living. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart already hammering. The smell was getting stronger, which meant whatever was causing it was getting closer. My tent was dark, but there was enough moonlight to see shadows and outlines. I fumbled for my flashlight but couldn't find it in the dark. That's when it happened. The front flap of my tent moved. Not from wind. Something deliberate, something controlled. The zipper was only halfway up and through the gap I saw it, a massive arm reaching in. Light brown, covered in hair or fur that was maybe 3 to 4 inches long. The hand at the end of it had long fingers, too many joints, too much flexibility. Clearly not human. I couldn't breathe, literally could not force air into my lungs. It was like my body shut down while my mind went into overdrive. The arm, God, it was thick as my thigh, moved slowly, purposefully. The hand was feeling around inside my tent, sweeping back and forth about a foot off the floor. I pressed myself against the back wall of the tent, trying to become as small as possible. The hand kept searching, like it knew something was in there but couldn't quite locate it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that maybe it couldn't see well in the dark. Or maybe it was tracking me by smell but couldn't pinpoint my location. I was hyperventilating by then, making these tiny gasping sounds I couldn't control. The arm froze, the fingers splayed out like it was trying to sense vibrations or something. I was about to scream, had actually taken the breath to do it, when the arm suddenly withdrew, just pulled back out through the tent flap like it had been yanked away. Then I heard them talking, not talking like humans talk. These were vocalizations, deep, rumbling sounds that had structure to them, patterns, two distinct voices communicating with each other outside my tent. One was lower, with these grunting inflections that felt masculine. The other was higher, with more vowel sounds, almost musical in a grotesque way. Feminine, I thought. The fear inside me changed then. Before, it was the fear of the unknown, what was reaching into my tent. Now it was the fear of understanding. There were two intelligent, non-human creatures right outside, and they were aware of me. Through the thin nylon of my tent, I could see their silhouettes against the pre-dawn sky, massive, standing upright, maybe 8 feet tall, both of them, broad across the shoulders and chest. The shapes of their heads looked almost conical, pointed at the top, then sloping down to what must have been powerful jaws. No necks that I could discern, just these huge hulking forms standing there communicating. I couldn't move, couldn't call out. All I could do was watch their shadows and listen to those sounds passing between them. The lower voice made a series of quick barks. The higher voice responded with something that rose and fell like a question. Then, without warning, both creatures let out these piercing yells. Not screams, not howls. Something between a roar and a call, loud enough that it seemed to vibrate my bones. And they ran. I could feel the ground shake slightly as they moved away from my tent at incredible speed. The sound of branches breaking and underbrush being crushed faded within seconds. I sat there in absolute stillness for I don't know how long. Minutes? An hour? Time had stopped making sense. Eventually I realized I was shaking uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard I worried they might break. I was soaked in sweat despite the cool night air. The smell lingered. That's what convinced me I hadn't dreamed it. That impossible, terrible odor hung in the air for at least another hour, gradually fading but never completely disappearing. I didn't leave my tent, not even to find the guys. Some irrational part of my brain was convinced that if I stayed perfectly still, perfectly quiet, I'd be safe. If I moved, they might come back. So I just sat there, back pressed against my sleeping bag, knees pulled up to my chest, watching the tent opening and listening to every tiny sound in the forest. The sky slowly lightened from black to dark blue to gray. Birds started singing. Normal forest sounds returned. When the sun finally rose enough that golden light filtered through the trees, I felt this wave of relief so intense I almost threw up. I changed my clothes because the ones I'd slept in were drenched with sweat. My hands were still shaking. I had to try 3 times to tie my shoes. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside, everything looked normal, peaceful. The morning was cool and clear with dew on the grass and mist rising between the trees. Beautiful even. I stood there looking around for any sign of what had happened. Footprints, broken branches, something. But I wasn't about to go searching through the underbrush alone. As I walked back toward the main campsite, I kept turning around, scanning the tree line, certain I was being watched. At breakfast I couldn't eat. My stomach was in knots. I just held a cup of coffee, watching the steam rise, trying to look normal while my mind raced. Should I tell someone? Would anyone believe me? Would they think I was trying to prank them or that I'd snuck some whiskey and had a nightmare? "Sleep okay?" one of the instructors asked me. "Yeah, fine," I heard myself say. One by one, I listened to the others talk about their night. Someone saw a deer. Someone else complained about rocks under their sleeping bag. Normal stuff. Nobody mentioned strange smells or weird noises or 8-foot-tall creatures prowling around our campsite. We were supposed to stay another night, but I made up an excuse about forgetting important medication at home. One of the instructors drove me back to Albuquerque that afternoon. I didn't go camping again for 7 years. It took me months to tell anyone. When I finally did, my cousin, who was into cryptozoology, he got all excited and showed me books about Bigfoot sightings. Some of the descriptions matched what I experienced. The height, the smell, the vocalizations. But in most of those stories, people just caught glimpses from a distance. They didn't have one reach into their tent while they were inside. The thing that haunts me most isn't the memory of that arm reaching in. It's the communication between them, the deliberateness of it, the intelligence. These weren't just animals operating on instinct. They were communicating complex ideas. One of them reached in, didn't find what it wanted, and conveyed that to the other. They made a decision together. They were hunting, searching, I don't know. And why did they run? What scared them off? Sometimes I think they sensed something else approaching. Maybe humans from our camp or some other predator. Sometimes I think they simply realized I was awake and decided it wasn't worth the risk. I'll never know. I've read theories about Bigfoot being some sort of undiscovered primate, or an ancient human ancestor that somehow survived extinction, or even something interdimensional. I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I experienced. For years afterwards, I'd wake up at exactly 4 in the morning, heart pounding, certain something was reaching into whatever room I was sleeping in. I'd smell that odor again, just for a split second, then it would be gone. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, slept with lights on, all the typical trauma responses. Time has dulled it somewhat. I can camp again now, though never alone, never in New Mexico. I've told a few more people over the years. Some believe me, some don't. Most just nod politely like they're humoring me. I graduated from that trade school a month after the incident and spent 32 years working as a draftsman for an engineering firm in Phoenix. Married, had 2 kids, got divorced, retired, a normal life in most respects. But that night changed something fundamental in me. It shattered the comfortable boundaries I had about what exists in the world and what doesn't. I don't go looking for answers anymore. I don't join Bigfoot hunting expeditions or post on cryptid forums. I've had researchers contact me after hearing my story third-hand, wanting interviews or to take me back to the location. I always decline. Here's why. Whatever was outside my tent that night in 1983 wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was intelligent. It was purposeful. It communicated. And if things like that exist in our world, moving through the forests just beyond the edge of our communities, what else exists that we haven't documented or acknowledged? That arm reaching into my tent tore open more than just the fabric of my shelter. It tore open my understanding of reality, and some tears can't be mended. Sometimes when I'm driving through the mountains or hiking a trail, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line or stopping to listen to the forest a little too intently. I'll notice a strange smell on the wind and my heart will skip a beat. 40 years later, and I'm still looking over my shoulder because I know they're out there and I know they're watching,